This story is one I never wanted to tell. The thought of what happened is enough to drive any normal person crazy. I wish it never happened. I wish it was just an incredible nightmare that haunted my dreams. But it isn't. The reason I'm telling it is so that someone somewhere might know what really happened and they could stop it from ever happening again. If you're reading this, please read the whole thing and understand what you must do if this thing ever starts up again. Please pass this information on to anyone who might be left. It isn't just about being careful not to get infected. There are several important things to learn to ensure it doesn't happen this way again. I left this book in a safe place. I pray you found it and take the time to rest and read all that happened. It starts in the distant past. Long ago, dinosaurs were the dominant species on the planet. For countless years, they reigned over the world, having no aspirations of grandeur or greed. All they cared about on a day-to-day basis was survival. When the meteor came, there was speculation that they had died instantly, that these sudden atmospheric changes were too much for them to overcome. Other theories say that something else came with the unwelcome visitor from space, something more sinister, something that made the dinosaurs turn against each other and kill those who had survived the harsh changes wrought on the planet. The answer to this question was buried long ago, deep in layers of rock, waiting to be discovered. It rose, invisible, undetected through miles of cracks and fissures in the rock. It had laid dormant for thousands of years until the barrier was broken by unsuspecting fools. It rushed and swirled in the water that it hadn't touched in centuries. The rock that held it captive crumbled, releasing its unwitting prisoner into the life-giving liquid that flowed through, destroying rock as it went. Unrestrained, it multiplied with the bacteria in the water and grew prosperous. It would have languished there if the water hadn't been given time to settle. It would have eventually been absorbed back into the rock and encased in its prison once again. Sometimes perfect timing can be a wonderful thing that blesses those who benefit from it. Other times, perfect timing can cause destruction on a massive scale. Thousands of feet above on the surface, a lone man stood, having no idea of the danger beneath his feet and what was waiting to be unleashed on an unsuspecting world. Joe was a medium-sized man with long hair, a mustache, and beard. Not the kind that was well-groomed and neat, the kind that showed he had just stopped caring about appearances and had no time to bother trimming. It was the kind of appearance that spoke of a homeless man, or one that was always on the road. More often lately, Joe thought he wouldn't mind trading places with a homeless person. At least they don't work 18 hours a day, 7 days a week like he did. His only comfort were the paychecks. Overtime was tolerated as long as the job got done and Joe was able to do the work of both people now that his partner had quit last month. The company had compensated him for working alone and promised that they would get him a new partner soon. But Joe wasn't holding his breath. He knew they were violating a ton of rules by not having a two-man crew for safety. He also knew that even with the extra money that he was getting, they were still saving thousands by having only one man working the truck. Joe struggled with the pump's controls, eventually kicking it when they refused to respond. The pressure gauges had been rising steadily and the release valves weren't doing their job. Finally, the kick seemed to break something loose and the pressure began to stabilize. That's better," he said as though praising a pet for fetching a ball. "You keep this up and we might make it out of here in an hour or so." He stepped away from the controls and went to the cab, retrieving an egg salad sandwich from his lunchbox that he had bought at a grocery store yesterday because it was half off. He peeled the plastic wrap away from the container and grabbed the triangle of sandwich, devouring it in 3 bites. The truck usually kept him so busy that he routinely forgot to eat. Pulling out the other half of the sandwich, he leaned against the door that said, Joe & Sons, Marcellus Shale Drilling. He chuckled when he first came up with the name, seeing that he was 30 years old, unmarried, and he had no children, at least that he knew of. The company had insisted that each team come up with an original name to put on their truck. They wanted to give the impression of local workers getting local jobs, even though Joe knew that it was all a lie. There were no local workers. They all worked for a large corporation that kept them on the road going from site to site 52 weeks a year. He had once asked for a vacation and was laughed out of his supervisor's office. That was when he started looking at this job as temporary. His plan was to save enough money for a house and settle down somewhere with low cost of living, and work some low-stress, low-paid job while living off the interest from his savings. At the rate that he was currently making money, it was no more than 2 years away. He didn't mind living out of a suitcase for the realization of his dream. Perhaps someday there would be an actual Joe & Sons. As he leaned there, finishing his sandwich and dreaming of the future, suddenly the truck began to shake. He dropped the last bite of his sandwich and dashed for the controls. The pressure gauge was pegged in and the release valve wasn't responding. He wrestled and kicked and punched every lever and switch that he could think of, but this time they didn't return to normal. The threshold had been crossed and there was no going back. The ground rumbled a moment before a geyser of dirty water erupted under his feet, knocking him back. He landed hard, his head bouncing off of the ground. Sometime later, he had no idea how long, Joe woke to the horrible sight of water shooting hundreds of feet into the air. He shut off everything, trying to get the water under control. After an exhausting hour, the pressure had subsided and he was able to stop the flow. He collapsed to the ground, soaking wet, and he laid there for a few minutes to gather his energy. Pulling out his cell phone and making sure that it still worked, he sighed and then called the number of the one person he had no desire to talk to. On the third ring, his boss answered. "Hey," Joe said. "No, I'm not done yet." "Why? Because this piece of crap truck you gave me just had another malfunction." "Of course it's contained," Joe said, looking at the river of shale water running through the field towards a group of houses. "Look, just give me another truck." "Yeah, I know what to do with this one. Of course I'll make it look like an accident. The insurance company won't pay if I don't. And I get another bonus for not reporting this right." "What do you mean we'll see? Maybe I'll see if I can walk away from this truck and call the EPA." "Yeah, that sounds like a great number for a bonus. Pleasure doing business with you." Joe hung up the phone and smiled. Maybe he would be able to retire a little sooner than he thought. He tossed the phone in the truck and wiped his face with a handful of paper towel. The smell of the water was making him half sick. He couldn't wait to get to the next hotel and take a shower. Unconnecting the hoses didn't take long. He capped the pipe and made sure it was secure. Looking over the river of dirty water heading for the group of houses, he shrugged. It should be fine, he thought. I'm sure the ground will filter the water before it gets to the wells. He hopped in the truck, started it up, and headed down the road, looking for a good place to have his accident tomorrow morning. Tonight was about getting cleaned up and a good night's sleep. The water had begun to settle. It had stirred around and was about to soak back into the rock for another 1,000 years or so when suddenly, it was carried up in a wave of pressure. It rose through the layers of rock, finally exploding into the open air for the first time in several millennia. Flying hundreds of feet in the air, it came crashing down in the flow of water that ran through the field. The stream carried it toward the houses and the people living in them when a depression made a pool and it was caught. The rest of the water continued unabated toward the houses, but it was stuck. With no way of propelling itself with the rest of the water, it had no choice but to wait. Waiting was one thing that it was good at. That and reproducing once it came to the right host. The coyotes had been watching Joe for days, always waiting for a chance to exploit any weakness. The lights in the big machine kept them at bay, but they were never far and always watching. The newly formed river presented them with a welcome new watering hole. The leader approached and sniffed the water. He recoiled, not liking the scent. Something about it seemed wrong. It seemed almost instinctual, like something embedded in centuries of DNA, a warning that he couldn't explain. But in the end, thirst was thirst and water was water. The entire pack began lapping it up. It had waited a much shorter time than it had anticipated. Being pulled out of the water and into the host, it immediately began doing what it did best, reproducing. It wouldn't be long until it would pass to the next host and then the next. If it was possible, it would have been smiling. Gus Swanson was a mountain of a man. His entire life, all that he had ever wanted was to be a farmer. His father owned a farm and started teaching Gus from the time that he could toddle out of the barn behind him. Gus took to it like fish to water. He had been a good enough student, but after he had graduated, there was no talk of wasting money on college. He went to work for his father just like he had done for most of his life. When his father had passed away unexpectedly, Gus continued running the farm. He had been taught every aspect, even the business end, which was the only part that he didn't like. He had lived alone since his father's passing and was just fine with that. He wasn't an unfriendly person. He would shoot the breeze with people in town when he went to the store. But so much of the farm work is solitary work. He just became accustomed to being alone. When he was approaching 40, those who liked to talk about everyone other than themselves assumed Gus would be alone for the rest of his life. And that was when Anna Lee came to town. She had been passing through looking for work and bumped into Gus as he was coming out of the grocery store. It wasn't love at first sight. It was, I know this is the person I'll spend the rest of my life with at first sight. Within 6 months, they stood in front of a justice of the peace and swore their vows to each other. A little over a year later, he was introduced to the second love of his life, his daughter, Abilene. The three of them were the happiest family you ever saw. They doted on each other and did everything to take care of one another. When Abilene was old enough to walk, she started following her father out to the barn, and he taught her about farming. He hated it when she got old enough to go to school. He missed having his little buddy tag along with him during the farm work. But as soon as she got home every day, she would run out to the barn and help her daddy. As it goes with most small farms, they're only ever one bad crop away from bankruptcy. The big corporations are more than happy to swoop in and steal. Buy small farms and then turn around and hire the farmer to work the very land that used to be his. Gus too ran into such hard times, but instead of letting the vulture corporations take his farm, he mortgaged the house to stay afloat. It worked in the short term, but it didn't take care of the long-term problem that it could happen again at any time. When the man came around offering him money to let him dig for gas, Gus scoffed and was about to run him off, until the man told him how much money he would be getting on a monthly basis for just having a pipe in his field. Even though he had never heard of Marcellus Shale before, the money was just too good to pass up. Gus agreed to the deal and kept a sharp eye for the other shoe to drop. Well, today was the day it dropped. Gus never needed an alarm. 5 o'clock every morning he was up. Somehow, Anna Lee was always up before him. While he showered and dressed for the day, She would cook breakfast and fill his thermos with coffee. This morning he came out to a breakfast of bacon, eggs, and toast. "This smells amazing," he said, giving Annalie a hug and a kiss. "Breakfast smells good too." "Flattery will get you everywhere," she said, leaning down and giving him a kiss as she handed him his plate. He smiled as spouses do when little Abilene came bounding out to the table. "Good morning, Pumpkin," Gus said. "How'd you sleep?" "I had a dream about an alligator that was having tea with a moose," she said as Annalie brought her over a plate, and then she sat her own down beside them. "Well, that sounds interesting," Annalie said. "What happened next?" "Well, the moose told the alligator he was in the wrong dream, and then he apologized and laughed." "Well, that was very polite of the alligator," Gus said. "Too bad they aren't like that in real life." "Oh, what are you going to do today, Daddy?" "No, I thought I would start on that new chicken coop." "After you take care of the cows." "Well, of course, I'll feed all the animals first." "No, I mean the cows," Abilene said, pointing out the window that faced the pasture. Gus and Annalie's eyes followed where Abilene was pointing. It took a minute to see what she was talking about, but once they did, Gus sighed. "You're right, after I take care of the cows." Annalie saw the cows stuck in the deep mud, struggling to get out. "Could they hurt themselves like that?" she said. Maybe," Gus said, getting up from his half-eaten breakfast and kissing them both before heading out the door. "Good luck, Daddy," Abilene called after him. He ducked back in the door and smiled at them. Gus's luck didn't seem to be very good as he pulled on the stuck cow, trying to free it. "No, come on, Elsa, work with me," Gus said, pulling on the cow that had gotten stuck in the mud next to a large pool of water that wasn't there yesterday. He tugged, trying to help her out as she mooed in protest. Finally, she got her front foot unstuck and lurched forward. Gus lost his balance and fell into the pool, making a massive splash. He sat up and watched as the cow lumbered off. Gus Swanson was not a small man by any means. Pushing 7 foot tall and 300 pounds, he was a force to be reckoned with when he wanted to be. Most times, though, he was gentle as a mouse. If anything could get under his skin, it was these cows. Farming was in his blood. As a third-generation farmer, he knew the ins and outs. Most people came to him when they needed help with their farms. It was rare that Gus needed or would ask for help from anyone else. It was just his nature not to bother anyone. He got up and shook off as much of the water as he could and then went to the barn and gathered what he needed to build a fence around the offending puddle. An hour later, his impromptu barrier stood surrounding the mud pit. "There, that ought to keep the rest of you brain surgeons out of here until it can dry up," Gus said to the group of cows around him. As if to answer, one of the cows mooed at him. Once he was finished and looked around for what had caused the puddle, the answer soon became evident. He knew that it hadn't rained for a few days and looked over at the truck tracks leading away from the eroded dirt where the river seemed to have started. He sighed. When they came to him with the idea of drilling in his field, his answer was a rather emphatic no. Like so many other times, his wife had gently reminded him that they could use the money. He packed up his tools in the back of his pickup truck and started it up. The red flashing light told him that it was time to go get some gas. He drove to the local gas station that also doubled as a truck stop due to its closeness to the interstate. It was a good place to meet and greet some of the truckers that passed through on their way to wherever they were going. As much as Gus was a quiet man, he was always up for some news of what was going on outside of Larson County. His wife told him to watch the news, but he never trusted the news. They were always pushing a certain agenda and you never heard anything good. At least with the truckers, you had a chance of something positive. When Gus walked in to pay for his gas, Bill the owner stopped him in his tracks. "Whoa," Bill said, "nobody told me." "Told you what?" Gus said. "About the herd of skunks that attacked you." "Oh, you're a real comedian, aren't you?" Gus said, rolling his eyes. Bill laughed as he took Gus's money and rung up his gas. "So what'd you get into that has my station smelling so lovely?" That dang fracking guy," Gus said. "Made a mess and then left me to clean it up." "I told you that stuff was no good," Bill said. "Leave what's underground down there." "I tell that to my bank account," Gus said. "My mortgage got caught up because of the money that fella gave me to drill." "It ain't drilling," Bill said. "Whatever, I just..." Gus stopped short and turned pale. "Hey, you alright?" "Yeah, I suddenly just feel a little under the weather." "You," Bill said. "In all the years I've known you, I don't think I've ever seen you sick." Gus tried to steady himself by leaning on the counter when he suddenly vomited all over the counter and Bill. "Christ," Bill said. Sorry about that." "You need to get your butt home," Bill said, looking at the mess that him and his counter were wearing. "I'll be all right," Gus said, looking a half shade less pale. "No, you won't," Bill said, looking red in the face. "Now, if you don't get out of here..." Gus turned and walked toward the door. He stopped and turned back to apologize again, but Bill had already gone to the restroom to clean himself up. When he got home, Annalie immediately knew something was wrong. "You look terrible and you smell terrible," she said. "Well, it's nice to see you too," Gus said weakly, collapsing on the couch. She came over and felt his head. "That feels like you have a fever," she said, and then went to the medicine cabinet and returned with a thermometer. Gus refused to open his mouth. "If you want, I can go get the other thermometer, roll you over and take your temp that way." He sighed and opened his mouth. He pulled the blanket off the back of the couch and covered up as she took the thermometer out and examined it. 103.5, that's way too high. She found some fever medicine and gave it to him. As soon as he swallowed it, he rolled over and began to shiver. Hours later, when Abilene came home from school, she was shocked to see Gus covered up on the couch. "What's wrong with Daddy?" she said. "Oh, he isn't feeling too good," Annalie said. "Should we take him to the doctor?" "I mentioned it to him, but he doesn't want to go." "Well, should I ask him?" Annalie looked at her daughter and wondered when she had gotten so mature. "Go ahead, sweetie, maybe you can get him to listen." Abilene approached the giant form taking up the entire couch slowly. "Daddy," she said. The blanket moved a little. "Daddy," she said again, reaching her tiny hand up to nudge his shoulder. He recoiled from the touch. "Daddy, if you're really sick, then you need to go see a doctor." He made a noise that she couldn't identify. It could have been a grunt, a chuckle, or a growl. "Does that mean you'll go?" The blanket was still. "Please, I don't want anything to happen to you. What would Mommy and I do if you weren't here?" Tears formed in the corners of her eyes, threatening to spill down her cheeks. The blanket rolled over and Gus faced her. Seeing the tears in his little girl's eyes was too much. His stubborn will broke. "Don't cry, baby. Let's go see the doctor together." She tried to give him a hug, but he held her back. You probably shouldn't hug me right now. The last thing that I want is for you or your mom to catch what I've got." They helped him up and out to the old truck that Gus had owned since he was 19. Old Blue, they called it. He had taken care of it, and it had returned the favor by lasting and running like a dream. Annalie helped Gus into the passenger side, surprised and concerned at how little strength he seemed to have. Once Gus was in, Abilene crawled into the middle seat and Annalie got behind the wheel. They started down the road slowly. Annalie not wanting to jar Gus around too much in his weak state. Once they got on the main road, it was smooth sailing. With only 5 miles to go to the hospital on the other side of town, both of them were hopeful that the doctor could find out what was wrong and get Gus back to his old self. Red and blue lights flashed, making the surrounding trees look like some impromptu disco. 2 police cars and 3 ambulances sat on the side of the road as the tow truck pulled the blue pickup out of the trees. Half of the cab was crushed from when it had rolled over. Once it was safely up on the side of the road, the EMTs and police moved in to see if anyone was hurt or even alive. None of them felt hopeful. After doing this for a while, they had all gotten a feel for where there would be no survivors. They opened the driver's side door and found a woman in her 30s, or what was left of her. A tree branch had gone through the windshield and crushed her chest. The young girl in the middle seat hadn't fared well either. The truck was an older one without airbags, and she looked like she hadn't been wearing a seatbelt at the time of the crash. She was bloody and bruised with debris all around her. The EMT checked for a pulse and found none. It was later determined that she had died of internal injuries. They gently removed the bodies and went around to check on the large man. Surprisingly, he was still breathing. He also was bleeding and much worse for wear, but there were no fatal injuries. He was only unconscious. They got him out, needing 3 EMTs to drag him out of the truck and strap him on a gurney. "Oh my God," the first EMT said to the second. "Have you ever seen anything like that before?" "Never. Let me go get the officer." Officer Hayden was having a problem of his own. Once the bodies were out of the truck and on gurneys, he looked them over to give his initial report of what had happened and how they had died. As he had examined past the main fatal wound on the woman, he noticed her arms had several bite marks. The pattern looked to be human teeth. They looked large, like it wasn't the girl who did it, which only laughed. "Officer," the breathless EMT said, "we need you to come look at this." "Take a look at this first," he said, indicating the bite marks. "What the heck?" the EMT said, examining them closer. "They don't look like any animal bite that I've ever seen. They look human." "I agree. What did you want to show me?" She led him around to the other side of the truck and pointed towards Gus's face. "Take a look at that." Hayden leaned close and examined Gus's face. There were raised blood vessels all over it. It looked like worms were under his skin chasing each other around. "I've never seen anything like that," he said, reaching out and touching one of the raised spots. Gus's eyes opened. Hayden recoiled. Gus's eyes were red, not bloodshot, but fully red. There was no white at all. "Sir," Hayden said, setting the shock aside and letting his training kick in. "You've been in an accident. Are you hurt?" Gus didn't take his eyes off of Hayden. He didn't look around or anywhere other than the officer. "What's your name?" Hayden said. Gus didn't reply. "Can you talk?" Gus said nothing, only stared. "We're going to take you to the hospital." Gus tried to move, but these straps held him firmly in place. For the first time, he looked somewhere other than Hayden's eyes. He looked at the straps that held him down and became agitated. "We need to have you secured for your own safety," Hayden said. Gus stopped moving and made a soft sound. "What was that? I couldn't hear you," Hayden said, leaning a little closer. Gus made another sound, causing Hayden to lean a little closer. "I didn't catch." Gus moved like lightning. He thrust his head up and grabbed Hayden's ear with his teeth. Hayden screamed as the EMTs tried to get Gus to let go. Finally, Hayden pulled hard enough to break free, but left a bite of his ear behind in Gus's mouth. Gus thrashed and growled. Spittle flew from his mouth into everyone's face. Hayden held his ear and yelled, "Get him out of here!" The EMT struggled to lift the gurney up into the ambulance, partly because of Gus's sheer size and partly because of him thrashing around. Hayden held his ear as he watched the ambulance carrying Gus rush off to the hospital, lights and siren blaring. The EMTs radioed in to tell the emergency room staff to prepare for a combative patient. The whole way there, the driver struggled to keep the ambulance on the road as Gus struggled against his restraints, throwing the ambulance back and forth as they drove. The second EMT looked back and saw the destruction that Gus had caused. Sparks flew from the machines that Gus had slammed his head against and destroyed. When they got to the ER, they were met by 2 orderlies and 2 security guards. "Why aren't you in the back with the patient?" One of the orderlies asked the EMT that hopped out of the passenger side. "You'll see, coming around to the back doors." One of these security guards nudged the other. "Maybe the victim said some mean words to her," he said with a chuckle. The EMT smiled. "This should wipe the grins off your faces," she said, opening the back door. Her intention had been to shock them with what they saw. She had no idea that Gus had broken out of one of his restraints and was well on his way to breaking out of the other. He was standing on one leg with the other still restrained. In a heartbeat, all 6 hospital personnel were in a fight for their lives. Gus clawed and spat at them as his last remaining restraint grew weaker by the minute. One of the guards pulled out his pepper spray and sprayed it at Gus. For a short moment, it looked like it might work. Gus recoiled and staggered back. The problem was the EMTs and orderlies were coughing and gagging from the spray as well, and they couldn't take advantage of the moment. The second guard pulled out his taser and tried to aim at Gus. He could barely keep his eyes open from the pepper spray, let alone aim a weapon, but that didn't stop him. It also didn't stop him from shooting one of the hooks into an orderly. Fortunately, the other hook landed on the ground and couldn't complete the circuit, so the orderly didn't get 50,000 volts surging through his body. The guard realized his mistake, changing cartridges, and wiped his eyes with the sleeve, and then fired again. This time he managed to hit Gus on the chest, sending the massive voltage down the wires into his fevered body. He fell back on the gurney and lay still. All 6 of them looked at each other the best they could through stinging eyes, and then the guard holding the taser said, "Well, get in there and put a new strap on him." The orderlies and EMTs looked at each other and seemed like they were having a mental stare down for who would approach Gus first. "We dealt with him at the crash site," the first EMT said. "It's your turn." The orderlies reluctantly stepped into the ambulance, keeping a close eye on Gus for any movement, and got 2 more straps to restrain him. They had just finished the second one when Gus woke up. The orderly wasn't expecting it, and Gus shot up as much as his restraints would allow and bit a chunk out of the orderly's arm. He screamed and fell to the floor, mostly to get out of range of Gus's teeth. He crawled out of the ambulance and walked away. "Where are you going?" the other orderly yelled. "You take care of that psycho, I'm done," he said, walking into the hospital with blood running down his arm. The orderly looked at the rest of them. "How do we get him out?" he said. "Very carefully," the EMT driver said. They approached the gurney and unlocked the wheels and then slowly pulled it out and tried to lower it to the ground when Gus decided to lurch sideways, sending the gurney tipping onto its side. It landed with a heavy thud, causing Gus to smack his head on the pavement. They all looked at each other, wondering who would take the blame for injuring a patient. The guard, still holding the taser, said, "I didn't see a thing." They all nodded in mutual agreement as they tried to right the gurney while avoiding Gus's snapping teeth. They got it back upright and were able to get Gus inside the hospital without further incident. After a quick report of the incident up to this point, omitting the tumble to the ground, a nurse made a quick assessment, and he was assigned a room away from the other patients where he could be quarantined. A precaution sign was hung on the door and a guard was permanently assigned to Gus's room. Dr. Tevist was the on-duty ER doctor. He came in wearing a gown, gloves, and a mask when he attempted to assess what was wrong with Gus. More restraints were added, and finally the nurse was able to draw blood and get an IV line in his arm, as well as sensors for his vital signs. Tevis watched as his vitals showed on the screen. His temperature was elevated, as well as his heart rate and pulse. Over the next several hours, they ran every test they could think of, but nothing explained all of his symptoms, especially the extreme aggression. Tevis tried giving Gus sedatives, but they didn't work. In fact, nothing worked. None of the fever-reducing meds had lowered his temperature as much as 1/10 of a degree. Giving him IV fluids did nothing as well. They even went as far as to try ice packs and putting him in the hospital's freezer for a few minutes. Everything about Gus's condition went against modern medical knowledge. Tevis was baffled and grasping at straws. He read the police report and then went to the nurse's station to make a call. Officer Hayden had just gotten back to the station after all the cleanup at the accident site. He got a cup of coffee and sat at his desk, pulling out his notepad to start typing up his report. After the first sip of coffee, he leaned back in his chair for a moment, trying to mentally picture what had happened in that truck to make it lose control. Everything pointed to Gus attacking his wife and child, but nothing in the man's profile showed him even capable of such a thing. Witnesses painted a picture of marital bliss and family happiness. He had even heard Gus's name around the neighborhood, but never anything negative. Just a good-hearted local farmer who would give a stranger the shirt off his back if he needed it. Hayden rubbed his temples, trying to stimulate his brain to make this all make sense. He touched the bandage covering his ear and found that it was still tender. What would make such a good man turn so animalistic and brutal, he thought. His phone rang and he stared at it for a long moment. He had no desire for any more tragedies tonight. He was about to let it go to voicemail when he reluctantly answered. "Officer Hayden, how can I help you?" "Yes, officer. My name is Martin Tevis. I'm a doctor over here at the hospital." "What can I do for you, doctor?" "I have a patient here, Gus Swanson. The report says that you were the reporting officer at the accident." "I was." "What can you tell me about it?" "I'm not sure how much I can tell you." "Well, I'm not trying to get anybody in trouble if that's what you're worried about." "That's not exactly what I meant. The accident itself is a mystery." "How so?" "Swanson's wife was driving and his daughter was in the middle seat, but they both seemed to be covered with bite marks." "Bite marks?" "Human bite marks." "You're saying this man attacked his own wife and child?" "It looks like it." "But why? Was it a domestic dispute?" "Everything I've ever heard about Gus Swanson said that he would never raise a hand to his wife or child." "And yet, here's evidence to the contrary." "Apparently. How's he doing, by the way?" "Well..." "Or is it against some rule for me to ask?" "It's not that. I'm not sure how he is. The way his vital signs are, he shouldn't be alive. His temperature is so high it's literally cooking his body, and yet he's still trying to tear out of his restraints." "Maybe you should give him a sedative." "I have. They don't work." "So are you thinking this thing, whatever he has, could be contagious?" "I'm not sure. That's why I wanted to talk to you and see if there was any more information that would help me figure it out." Both ends of the phone were silent as the men contemplated what could be done. "I'll tell you what, I need to swing by the Swanson place tomorrow. Would you like to ride along with me?" "What time?" Probably around 8 in the morning." "That'd be perfect. I'll be getting off shift. Pick me up at the hospital if that's okay." "Fine. I'll see you then." Both men hung up and sat staring at their respective phones for a long moment, wondering if there was something bigger going on behind the scenes. At 8 a.m. the following morning, Tevis walked out of the ER entrance and saw a flash of red and blue in the ER parking lot. He walked over to the cop car and looked in the window. "Officer Hayden, I presume," he said. "Dr. Tevis." "Call me Martin," Tevis said, extending his hand. Hayden reached out and shook it. "Dell," he said. "Like the computers." "Actually, it's Delmas, but I prefer Dell." "Dell it is," Tevis said, walking around to the other side of the car and getting in. Hayden started the car and headed down the road, announcing on the radio that he was heading to the Swanson place. "So how's your patient?" Hayden said. Exactly the same. He hasn't eaten or slept, his vitals are the same. Should have been dead hours ago. Did you happen to notice his eyes and the raised blood vessels? Hayden said. I did. What caused that? I have no clue. In my years as a doctor, I've never seen anything like it. Hayden drove in silence, lost in thought until they arrived at Gus's farm. He pulled up to the front door and parked. Getting out and walking up to the door, Hayden was about to knock when he remembered everyone who lived here was either dead or in the hospital. He opened the front door and walked slowly inside. Tevis followed, looking all around for anything that might give him a clue as to the cause of Gus's condition. He looked around the kitchen, opened the fridge, and looked through the trash. Hayden looked over at Tevis. What did the trash can tell you? It told me Gus was really sick before the accident. Really? There's some vomit in there. Oh, that's what I smelled when we walked in. They looked at the pictures on the wall and mantel of happy family moments together. Nothing gave any indication of how they would end up. They went through the entire house and weren't any closer to discovering why Gus was acting like an animal. Animal, Tevis thought. Didn't I hear you say that Gus was a farmer? Tevis said. Yep. Tevis headed out the back door toward the barn. He looked around at the animals that hadn't been tended to yet today. He went from one to the next, looking for any similar signs to Gus's symptoms. What are you looking for? I don't know, just anything out of the ordinary. Hayden stopped. He wasn't looking at Tevis anymore. Well, I think I may have found it, he said, looking into the pasture. Tevis followed his gaze and saw the cows in the field. Most of them were grazing like you would expect cows to do, but one of them was running around like an idiot. It was chasing the other cows and trying to bite them. Tevis and Hayden moved toward the fence to get a better look. The sight of a cow terrorizing the other cows was so ludicrous that it was mesmerizing. What does that remind you of? Hayden said. Tevis stared at the scene for a few minutes. Why aren't the others sick too? He said. Hayden saw that he was right. Only the one cow was chasing the others around. The rest of them were trying to do normal cow stuff. I don't know, he said. Maybe it got into that. Hayden pointed at the spot in the middle of the field where Gus had erected his impromptu fence to keep the cows out of the water. I need to get a sample of that, Tevis said, looking around for a shovel. You're not going in there. Do you know of another way of getting a sample? Tevis said as he found a shovel just inside the barn. Do you think it might be mad cow disease that somehow passed to a human? Well, there's only one way to find out, Tevis said. You think you could distract him for me? Cows are female, bulls are male. Sorry, Tevis said, rolling his eyes. Do you think you could distract her for me? Hayden sighed. I really hope distracting a cow is the craziest thing that I do today. All part of a day's work, Tevis said. No, it's not, Hayden said as he walked around to the opposite side of the fence. The entire time he was walking, the crazed cow kept her eye on him. Tevis snuck in between the fence and into the small fenced-off area. He quietly dug up a shovelful of the still damp mud. He held it on the shovel with his free hand and was about to climb back through the fence when he heard, "Look out!" He glanced up and the cow was running straight toward him. He jumped back inside the fence and the cow stopped before it ran him over, fence and all. It circled the small fence, making sounds that he had never heard a cow make before. It sounded like it was growling. Now would be a good time for the distraction part of the distraction, he yelled to Hayden. What do you want me to do? Distract, he said as the cow circled him. Suey, Hayden yelled. Here, girl, come on. That's a pig, not a cow. Well, what do you yell for a cow? How should I know? Come on, Jim, I'm a doctor, not a cowboy. Who the heck is Jim? Never mind. Tevis watched the cow's every move. He noticed the same redness in its eyes and the raised blood vessels on its skin. It stopped. Tevis got ready to run just in case it had grown tired of circling and was about to charge right through the fence. Suddenly it moved away. He was so surprised he just stood there watching. "Well, get your butt in gear, Mr. Distraction," Hayden yelled. "That's Dr. Distraction to you." Tevis joked as Hayden climbed through the fence and was literally running for his life as the cow turned away. Tevis climbed through the fence, carefully holding his mud on the shovel as he made his way through the field and out through the main fence. Once out, he turned and saw Hayden driving through the fence with a literal mad cow right behind him. Tevis set the shovel down and ran over to check on Hayden. "You okay?" he said. Just peachy," Hayden said, getting up and dusting himself off. "That's a nasty wound on your ear," Tevis said. "It looks new. When did you get that?" Hayden covered it. "A couple days ago," he lied. Tevis stared at him. "Well, you got your mud. Can we go now?" "Sure," he said as Hayden walked back to the car. Tevis went inside and got a plastic bag to put the mud in, and then he got in the car. The trip back was silent. Neither man said a word to the other until they were at the hospital. Tevis got out and turned back to look inside the car. Maybe you should." "Look, I told you that I hurt my ear a few days ago, so how about you drop it," Hayden said. "I was gonna say maybe you should have a vet take a look at that cow. Thanks for the ride. I'll let you know if I find anything." He walked away. Hayden opened his mouth to say something and then closed it and drove away. The new Frost Creek jail had a rocky history before it was even conceived. The old jail was so woefully out of date it would have been impossible to bring it up to code without tearing it down. Being a town that relied on its historical buildings to bring in tourist dollars, the commissioners weren't going to let that happen. Instead, they elected to build a new jail on the outskirts of town, thinking the additional benefits would be keeping the less than desirable residents at arm's length, out of sight, out of mind. The planners were given the go-ahead to draw up plans and find a contractor. When the plans were presented and the cost was announced, the commissioners pitched a fit. They insisted the developers cut costs. 3 full cell blocks got the axe, as well as the perimeter fence, motion detectors along with many security features. What resulted was a building that was barely passable as a jail. Even looking at the original blueprints, there's still a section where the 3 cell blocks exist. Comparing them to the actual building was like looking at someone who had had an arm amputated. You can see the partial hallway that was built, but it just ends with an outside door. And with any person who had such a handicap, life was more difficult. The commissioners insisted on filling the jail with anybody they could in hopes that it would bring them revenue. What many people didn't know was the full amount had already been budgeted. The money saved by cutting costs disappeared into the commissioners' pockets. Years later, the jail still struggles to meet their budget. Someone told the commissioners that you can make money with the jail, so they blamed those who work there for the loss of revenue. As with anything, you can find good people who will work for less than fair market value, even much less, mostly because they have no choice. But usually you get what you pay for, and the commissioners didn't want to pay anything. The staff at the jail was no exception to this rule. Deputy Warden Foos was a smaller man with beady eyes and a manipulative mind. He had come from a state prison under dubious circumstances. The rumor mill usually circulated conjecture as to why such a person would leave a much more lucrative position to come to this nothing town for nothing pay. Usually people chalked it up to one of 3 things: a failed relationship, an incident that was being swept under the rug, or the person was just an idiot that administration no longer wanted to deal with. In either case, the person usually came to the commissioners with glowing recommendations from the people who wanted to be rid of them. The commissioners accepted these people with open arms and bragged about how they were able to acquire people who had state training. They would leave such people in charge of discipline, training, and a myriad of other things that they should not be in charge of had the commissioners known the true nature of their departure from state. And Deputy Warden Foos was one of those people. To call him worthless was being kind. He came to Frost Creek Jail with a chip on his shoulder and an attitude about anybody who didn't immediately fawn over the plans that he had to improve the jail. Most people with any kind of common sense saw through it and recognized it as what it was. A pure narcissistic power play designed to show everybody who the boss was. He made it exactly 1 week of watching, allowing officers to show him around and show him how the jail runs before he showed his true colors. Morning briefings at the Frost Creek County Jail were usually a boring routine. The sergeant would read off updates of issues on all the blocks while the officers fought to stay awake. Today was a little different. Deputy Warden Foos stepped into the briefing room as Sergeant Thompson had just finished his morning briefing. "Is there anything you would like to add?" Thompson said to Foos. "Well, as a matter of fact, there is," he said, stepping to the podium as Thompson backed out of his way. "You people have no discipline. You have no idea of what real security is. I'm astounded that nobody has escaped from this place. Everything is lax, everybody's lazy, each of you would be eaten alive at state." "Oh, like he was," Lycan said to Crilly out of the side of his mouth. Crilly fought to keep a straight face. "Oh, what was that?" Foos said, glaring at Lycans. "Nothing, sir." "No, I don't think it was nothing. I think it was my first official reprimand." "He was only saying how much he's looking forward to learning from somebody as knowledgeable as you," Crilly said, and then added, "Sir." Foos eyed him and then Lycans. "We'll begin a new training program this week. You will all have to study and pass a weekly test if you want to keep your jobs, and I'll be doing individual assessments personally." He glared at Lycans and Crilly. "Dismissed." The room cleared out quickly, all except for Foos and Thompson. "Would you like to give me a little more warning before you have a hissy fit on my officers?" Thompson said. "Be careful of your tone, Sergeant," Foos said. "I could do your evaluation first." "What do you think this is, the military? These people aren't here doing a tough job for the same pay they could be working at a fast food joint, and you want to come in here bellowing at them and insulting them. Who do you think you are?" Foos tried to stand a little taller despite the fact that Thompson was nearly a foot taller than him. "I think I'm your supervisor, and I think you're fired." Thompson walked straight past him towards the admin offices. "Where do you think you're going?" Foos said, having to jog to keep up with him. Without answering, he marched toward the warden's office. Foos ran and got in front of the door. "Don't knock on that door, you're fired." "I could knock with my fist," he said, shoving it in Foos's face. "Or your skull, you choose." Foos's eyes grew wide as he stepped aside. "I can bring you up on criminal charges for terroristic threats," he said as Thompson knocked. There was a moment of silence in which Foos got a smug look on his face. If the warden wasn't in, then Thompson had no one to complain to. Foos was second in command. Finally, there was a muffled, "Come in." Thompson opened the door, but Foos rushed in first. "Sir, this man is guilty of insubordination and terroristic threats," Foos said quickly before Thompson could open his mouth. "I fired him. He needs to be escorted off the premises." Warden Taylor was a large man going to seed, just entering his 60s. He had thoughtful eyes with laugh lines around them. He sat back in his chair and looked from Foos to Thompson and then to his watch. "Well, Carl, that only took you a week," the warden said. Thompson sat in the chair across from the warden and took a deep breath and then let it out. "It hasn't been easy. The straw was when he tore my people a new one at briefing." "Now just wait a minute." "Was it justified?" Taylor said, ignoring Foos. "Not in my eyes," Thompson said. "Yes, we have some problems, but they're being monitored and handled when they need to be, and in the way that they need to be. Not carpet bombing everybody for what one or two are responsible for." It sounds reasonable, Taylor said. You do know that Mr. Foos has a lot of experience. At the state level, yes, Thompson said. This is county, and you know as well as I do that we do things a little differently than they do. Yeah, I know, Taylor said. But maybe if we tried some new ideas, we could better handle our old problems. Thompson stared at him without anger or malice. Yes, sir. Foos's face beamed like a little kid that had just been handed a present. And you, Taylor said, looking at Foos. You need to calm down. This isn't state. Our people don't get paid as much and don't get as much training, and don't have to deal with such large numbers of inmates. You need to adapt to the way that we do things here, not force everyone else to adapt to yours. Foos's face fell so far that he had to pick it up off the floor. Stop trying to get people in trouble, Taylor said. Don't be some petty tyrant or you won't last here long. I understand, sir, Foos said, with a whipped puppy look. Good, now shake Mr. Thompson's hand and show him much you're looking forward to working with him. Foos reached out and gave Thompson's hand one quick shake. Great, now that we're all on the same page, we can work together for the good of the jail, Taylor said. Yes, sir, they both said without enthusiasm. Excellent, Taylor said. So, Mr. Foos, if you would return to your office, I would like to have a word with Mr. Thompson. Foos looked at Thompson and opened his mouth to say something but thought better of it. He gave a quick nod and left the room, closing the door behind him. As soon as the door closed, Thompson let out a sigh. Why did the commissioner saddle us with that clown? He said. Oh, you know how these things go. They see a title on paper and think it's a feather in their cap to hire such a person. They feel it somehow gives the jail more credibility. Pardon my French, but that's BS, Thompson said. You know as well as I do they don't care about our credibility. It's theirs they want to boost. Taylor smiled. You didn't used to be this jaded, Carl. 10 years of working for people who don't give a crap about you will do that. Yeah, I hear ya. I've only been working here 4 years and I see it. So what do I do about Bozo? Thompson said, pointing his thumb toward the deputy warden's office. You do exactly what I said. So let him run roughshod over everyone. No, just throw him a bone every now and then. Listen to his ideas and try to implement one that makes the most sense. You know he's planning on making people pass a test every week just to keep their jobs. I didn't know that, Taylor said with a grimace. I'll have a chat with him. Thompson nodded and rose, heading for the door. Carl, Taylor said. Thompson stopped and turned back to face the warden. Do you really think he's that bad? Thompson thought for a moment. I think he's going to get someone hurt, Thompson said. I hope you're wrong. So do I. Today's episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. What are some of your relationship green flags? We often hear about the red flags we should look out for, but what if we focused more on looking for green flags instead? If you're not sure what they look like, therapy can help you identify green flags, actively practice them in your relationships, and embody this energy in yourself. Whether you're dating, married, building a friendship, or just working on yourself, it's time to form relationships that love you back, and BetterHelp can be a great tool to do that. BetterHelp is fully online, making therapy affordable and convenient, serving over 5 million people worldwide. Access a diverse network of more than 30,000 credentialed therapists with a wide range of specialties. Easily switch therapists anytime at no extra cost. Discover your relationship green flags with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/MrCreeps to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/MrCreeps. Stephen Lower pulled up to the hospital in his silver Mercedes, parked and then checked his appearance in the mirror. Finding everything in place, he carefully got out and straightened his custom suit. He looked at the dingy red brick building that he was about to enter and gave a sigh of disgust. How did I end up running a 200-bed hospital in Bumpkinville, smack dab in the middle of nowhere, USA? He thought as he entered through a private door that was near the executive offices, so he didn't have to see or deal with any of the patients. Bile rose in his throat as he entered the waiting room of his office and waved off his secretary on the way to his office proper. He had to stop thinking about it or he was going to vomit. A relatively young man for an administrator, in his mid-30s, handsome but quite bitter. His office had the best things that he could find. A huge mahogany desk, Persian rugs, even a Renoir painting hung on the wall. But Stephen Lower was not happy. He hadn't been happy since the incident lost him his job as a big-time doctor on the rise in a big city. After that, his father had to pull every string he could to get him this administrator's job in the sticks. He looked at his desk with a stack of meaningless papers about meaningless responsibilities to run this meaningless hospital. He sighed again, reached for a bottle and poured his first, but not last, drink of the day. Dr. Tevist walked through the hospital carrying a large black trash bag like he was on a mission. He walked into the lab, through the main reception area and straight to the back room where the real research happened. He walked in to find a rather attractive woman in what looked to be her mid-30s, looking into a microscope. He lifted the bag to set it on the table when the woman spoke. "I'm sure you weren't going to put some random bag on one of my sterile tables," she said without looking up from her microscope. Tevis set the bag on the floor. "No, of course not." Nicole Calvin looked up at Tevis and then down at the bag. "Are you bringing me your trash now?" This was the only thing that I could find to bring it in. You realize, of course, that the chemicals in any commercial trash bag will taint whatever results that I find. Tevis looked down at the bag. It was all. Calvin held up her hand. "Oh, don't bother. So what exactly am I supposed to be looking for?" "Your old doggy poo. I want to know if there's anything in that that could cause sickness in animals and humans." And Calvin scoffed. "I can tell you right now there is. We breathe in particles every day that can cause sickness." "Well, this is something different." Calvin gave him a curious eye. "If you already know something's in it, then why sully my lab?" "Call it confirmation," Tevis said. "Or call it what it is, proof that you can shove in our esteemed drunk administrator's face." "Or that," Tevis said with a half grin. Kelvin looked over at the half-dozen files on her desk that needed researching. "When do you need it by?" "Yesterday." Kelvin opened her mouth to protest. "If this is what I think it is, every minute is crucial. So this can save lives." "Lots of lives." She sighed. "All right, I'll finish up my current project and take a look at it. Am I assuming correctly that Admiral Alcohol doesn't know about this?" "You assume correctly." "Let's keep my name out of this, shall we? I'm already high up in his hit list, and if this is as bad as you think, it isn't going to make him a happy camper." Mom's the word. Appreciate it. So then, if you have no other life-saving evidence to barge in with, I'll leave you alone, Tevis said. Please call as soon as you get any results. Yes, sir, she said with a mock salute. Tevis went back to the ER and checked on Gus. He was still in exactly the same place with the same vitals doing the same thing, attacking anyone who came close enough. He found out that a nurse had made the mistake of getting too close and Gus had taken a chunk out of her breast as she leaned over to check his IV. Going to the nurse's station, he logged into a computer and started a list of everyone who had been injured by Gus. If there had to be a quarantine, these would be the first people. He started making a mental list of rooms that could possibly be candidates for a quarantine area. Nobody would be happy with it. Telling people that they can't go home isn't a very popular subject, but saving lives is saving lives. If only he could be sure. And dragging people kicking and screaming into a holding room against their will, only to find out that Gus wasn't contagious, was a quick way to flush his medical career down the toilet. Not knowing what else to do, but knowing if he was going to make this decision, he would need to do it quickly. He picked up the phone. "Officer Hayden, how can I help you?" he said on the third ring. "It's Tevis from the hospital. Have you found anything out?" "No, the vet went out to the farm and checked out our friendly cow," Hayden said sarcastically. "Well, how did that go?" "I had to put the cow down." "How did he get close enough?" "Let's just say that he's probably in your waiting room right now." "He got bit?" "I didn't even know a cow's teeth would break skin, but I guess if it bites hard enough." "You're kidding me, right?" "Everything about the last day or so seems like a joke. Sometimes I wish it was just a bad dream." "How's your ear?" Tevis said. "Just fine, thanks," Hayden said. "Maybe you should go and talk to the vet while you treat him." "I'll do that," Tevis said, but the line disconnected. He pulled up his potential quarantine list and added the name Officer Hayden and then put a question mark behind it. He saved the list and then went to find the vet. The waiting room was a little busier than usual. There were several people who had been attacked by animals, mostly coyotes. "I'm looking for the veterinarian that was attacked by the cow," Tevis said as a few people chuckled. A bald man in his 50s hesitantly raised his hand, shooting glances at the people who had chuckled as they suddenly found anywhere else to look except for him. Tevis escorted him to a room and told him to get on the bed while he checked his chart. "Sorry about that," Tevis said. "I needed to talk to you quickly." "Oh," the man said. "Why is that?" "Well, I visited your cow attacker yesterday," he said. "I've been trying to track down the source of an infection in one of my patients. And you thought it was a cow. I didn't know what to think. But it turns out the cow led me to what I believe to be the real source. And this little fenced-off area in the field," the man said with a far-off look. "Exactly. So did you find anything?" "I'm still waiting for results." "Then why did you want to talk to me so badly?" "I'm grasping at straws here, trying to figure out if I have a potential epidemic on my hands or if this will all just blow over." "What do you need to know?" Tevis sighed. "Did you see the cow's eyes?" "Well, of course, they were right in my face as it tried to chew my arm off." "Do you think it's mad cow disease or something else that could pass from animals to people?" The man looked at his arm and his eyes grew wide. "Well, I hadn't thought about it," he said with an edge of panic in his voice. "Is that what you think it is?" "I don't know. I've never seen a case of mad cow where the victim becomes so aggressive. Usually it's quite the opposite. They become lethargic and confused. They lose muscle coordination and symptoms of dementia appear." And Tevis collapsed into the patient chair beside the bed. "So it's not mad cow. Well, is that a good thing?" "Actually, no. If it was something that I could identify, then I could at least begin treatment. As it is, I'm throwing darts in the dark, not even knowing where the dartboard is." "Well, that sounds frustrating." Tevis shook himself to clear his head. "Let's get you fixed up," he said, treating the wound, while examining it as closely as possible. After he was patched up, Tevis took note of his name and wrote it down to add to his personal quarantine list. He stopped in at Gus's room to check on him. When he opened the door, the wave of stench hit him so hard that he nearly threw up. Gus was still strapped down, but he had defecated himself and was rolling around in it as he struggled against his restraints. Tevis did a quick check of his vitals and found no change, and then he stormed out to the nurse's station. "Who's in charge of the patient in quarantine?" he demanded. The nurses all looked back and forth at each other, none of them saying a word. "Who is it?" Tevis insisted. I suppose I am for this shift, sir, said a petite blonde woman who didn't look like she was very far into her 20s. Were you planning on leaving him to roll around and poop all day or do something about it? Sir, we were under the impression that he wasn't to be approached. Tevis pinched the bridge of his nose. He's restrained. I'm not telling you to let him loose, but you can go clean him up if you're careful and stay away from his mouth. He's still a human and a patient at this hospital. He deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. Yes, sir, the nurse said. I'm sorry, sir. Imagine if it was your father or your grandfather. Would you want either of them left to lay in their own feces? No, sir, I wouldn't. She got up and went straight to the quarantine room. Tevis took a breath and headed for the cafeteria. He couldn't remember the last time that he ate anything. On his way, his phone rang. Dr. Tevis, he said. It's Calvin. Can you come to my lab right now? On my way. He took a detour towards the lab. Food would have to wait. 2 minutes later, he knocked on the lab door. Calvin's face appeared in the window and the lock clicked as Calvin let him in. Once inside, she locked the door behind him. Tevis looked from her to the door. A precaution, Calvin said. I don't want anyone else exposed to this. Tevis sat slowly in the chair across from Calvin. Exposed to what? He said. Calvin sat and took a deep breath. Okay, let me start at the beginning and try my best to go slow so that I don't start talking in gibberish. Alright. So I took a sample of your mud here and made a solution to look at it in the microscope. Is it something dangerous like I thought? Oh, it's much more than that. I took a look at it just in the solution. I have never seen an organism quite like it. It was already reproducing, but then I added a tiny drop of human blood. Well, what happened? The most awesomely, impressively terrifying display of destruction that I've ever seen. It began multiplying at an astonishing rate. It swarmed the molecules of blood and devoured them. By the time that it was done, it had reproduced so much that it was overflowing the side and spilling out onto the microscope. So, what are your conclusions and what can I do about it? Calvin leaned back in her chair and stared at Tevis with what almost seemed like pity. My conclusion is this is the single most dangerous organism that I've ever had the misfortune to lay eyes upon, and I have no idea what you can do about it. Tevis stared blankly, dumbfounded. All his worst fears had just come true. This could be the next Black Plague, he said quietly. Calvin scoffed as she reached down into her drawer and pulled out a bottle of amber-colored liquid in 2 glasses. This thing could put the Black Plague to shame. Calvin poured some liquid in each glass. Tevis grabbed his and held it up, and Calvin tapped her glass against it. To the end of humanity, Calvin said as they both drank. What can I do? Preventing the spread is paramount, Calvin said. If this thing gets out in the open, it's game over. Tevis leaned forward, setting his glass on the desk and leaning on his knees. Well, how does it spread? It could be anything, Calvin said. Airborne, through skin, bodily fluids. No, it can't be airborne, Tevis said, his eyes darting back and forth as if reading a page. There was only 1 cow out of a half-dozen in the field that was infected. Tevis jumped to his feet and started pacing. So how did Gus and the cow both get infected? Tevis said, going back and forth across the small room as Calvin had watched him. Tevis snapped his fingers. The fence around the mud. The cow must have gotten stuck in the mud when it was drinking the water. But then how did Gus? Maybe he was trying to get the cow unstuck and he fell in the water, Calvin said. This thing is so virulent, I'm sure it would have used any mucous membrane it could to gain access to the bloodstream. So the only way it can pass from one host to another is through ingestion, or the transfer of bodily fluids. Tevis's face grew instantly pale. What's wrong? Calvin said. Gus has been biting people. Oh no. Tevis turned and ran toward the door. Wait a minute, Kelvin said. Tevis paused at the door. When you brought that mud in, did you get any on your hands? Tevis looked at his hands, knowing that he had handled the mud without any gloves on and knowing that it could be a death sentence. Nope, he said, and then ran out the door. He made it back up to the ER in record time and stepped at the nurse's station breathless. No one is to go into the quarantine room without full biohazard suits on, he said through ragged gasps of air. The nurses just looked at him mystified. He fought the urge to slap them, and then instead it took a moment to catch his breath. No one is to go into the quarantine room without a full biohazard suit on, he said. The nurses looked from one to the other. Oh, you might want to go tell that to the little nurse you scared half to death, one of the nurses said. She's still in there with them. And no one thought to go check on her, Tevis said, nearly screaming. He ran down the hall and threw open the quarantine room door, only to find his worst fears realized. Gus had a hold of both of the nurse's arms and was chewing at her neck. Blood sprayed everywhere as he tore into her artery. Her eyes and mouth were wide open, looking like she was screaming, but no sound came out. Tevis grabbed her around the waist and pulled, but Gus was too strong. He started screaming for help as he punched Gus in the face over and over, trying to get him to release his victim. Nurses and a guard arrived to find a doctor punching a patient in the face repeatedly and the room covered in blood. The guard grabbed Tevis and yanked him away from Gus. Not me, you idiots. He's killing her. The guard with a now unobstructed view saw the nurse's head flopping around as Gus tried to pull her back toward his open mouth. The guard grabbed a pillow and shoved it in Gus's face, and then started prying Gus's fingers from around her wrists one by one. Tevis continued pulling on the nurse until the guard finally released the last finger, causing Tevis to fall to the floor on his back, with the limp body of the nurse landing on top of him. He jumped up and picked her up off the floor, looking at the nurses who had just stood by uselessly and let their coworker be devoured. Get me a room, Tevis said to the group of dazed nurses. They stared back at him blankly. I said get me a room, he screamed. Finally, one of them came out of her haze and she bolted out the door with Tevis right behind her, carrying the tiny bleeding nurse. They went from room to room looking for one that was empty, but there didn't seem to be any. At last, she motioned him into an empty examination room and he laid her down on the bed. He began working on her immediately, trying to clear the airway and to see how damaged the artery was. Find out what her blood type is and go get me 3 units, Tevis said. The nurse disappeared. In the meantime, Tevis cut away loose tissue and opened her crushed airway. The sound of air flowing into her lungs was a relief. One of the other nurses wandered into the room. Get her set up for an IV and vitals, Tevis said. The nurse set up the sensors for the vitals and put a blood pressure cuff on her, and then she set up an IV line as the first nurse returned with 3 units of blood. Good. Hang one and get a broad-range antibiotic to inject into her IV, he said while starting to sew her artery closed. The blood had gone from a full spray to a small fountain as he sewed it shut. The first unit of blood was already gone by the time that he had sewn the artery back together. He hung the second unit and started working on her crushed windpipe when the monitor had flatlined. No, he said, starting chest compressions. Give me a crash cart. The first nurse disappeared and returned moments later with the cart. She already had it charging. Tevis grabbed a pair of scissors and cut her scrub shirt and bra off, pulling them away to expose a bare skin. He grabbed the paddles and placed them where they needed to go. Once the charge was ready, he yelled, "Clear," and he shocked her. The line stayed flat. He tried again and again, but there was no response. The second nurse tried to take the paddles away from him. "Get away from me," he yelled. "If you would have done your job, she might be alive right now." The nurse slowly backed away, hung her head, and started for the door. She paused and looked back at him. "I didn't send her in there." she said, and then quietly laughed. The paddles clattered to the floor. Tevis looked from the bloody, still body and then reached up and turned off the monitor, leaving a bloody thumbprint as he did. He looked at his blood-soaked hands and came to a realization. He ran to the sink and began scrubbing until his hands were raw. Only when every last drop of blood was gone did he finally stop, hang his head, and let the tears flow. After a minute he stopped, dried his hands and eyes, and then went back to Gus's room. It was straight out of a horror movie, and blood was everywhere. There was even some spray on the ceiling. In the middle of it all was Gus, still laying there strapped to his bed, covered in blood, growling and snapping his teeth at Tevis. "What am I gonna do with you?" he said. Gus didn't respond except to growl a little bit louder. Tevis turned and went to the nurse's station. Every nurse glanced up at him and then found some urgent thing to attend to so that she wouldn't make eye contact. "That room needs to be cleaned. Get an orderly to go in and mop up the blood, but he has to be in full biohazard suits and stay away from the patient. Am I understood?" Nobody looked up. Only the nurse who had tried to take the paddle said, "Oh, yes, sir." He felt his ire rising, but decided the best thing would be was to walk away. He walked around the ER, drawing shocked stares from the many people in the waiting room, when he finally found the security guard that had helped him. Even the guard gave him an odd look. "Come with me," Tevis said, and then turned and marched away. The guard looked around at people who were sneaking peeks at him and then followed after Tevis. He went to an empty conference room and motioned the guard inside. Once in, Tevis locked the door and sat in one of the chairs. The guard was still standing. "Please, sit," Tevis said. The guard eyed the chair as if it was about to yell at him, but sat in it anyway. "I wanted to say that you did an excellent job in that room," Tevis said. "You jumped in and helped when nobody else would." "Well, that's my job, sir." "No, you went above and beyond," Tevis said, leaning forward. "You put someone else's life and safety above your own, and you did it without hesitation." The guard shrugged. "It was all instinct, sir." Tevis sat back and smiled. "I love the false modesty, but now's not the time for it. I need your help." "Yes, sir." "There you go again, putting others ahead of yourself." "Would you rather that I said no?" Tevis chuckled. "After you hear what I have to say, you may want to, and I wouldn't blame you one bit." "I'm listening." Tevis sighed. "You know that patient that we just saved the nurse from?" "Yes, how is she, by the way?" "I'll tell you in a minute. The patient has a viral infection. It's made him violent. He doesn't think or understand like a normal human being anymore. All he wants to do is attack others and infect them with that same virus. He can't be reasoned with, and at that moment he can't be cured. The nurse, by the way, she's dead. He killed her." The guard took in a quick breath. "So you're saying this man is like what, a zombie?" "Let's not lighten the subject with silly stories and fiction. I mean, this is serious." "I'm being serious," the guard said. "Everything you said sounds exactly like a zombie. How about we use a word that's a little bit less cliche, like infected?" "That works for me. Why are you telling me this?" "Because I need your help." "Okay. How long have you worked here?" "A little over 2 years." "And how many of the other guards would you trust to act the same way you did in that room?" "Well, all of them, sir." "Come on, don't BS me. This is life and death, you saw that. I need to know how many of you I can trust." The guard thought for a moment. "Including me, probably 3. Tevis stared at him for a long moment. "I'm going to tell you something that you can't repeat to anyone except those other 2 guards you say that you can trust." "Okay?" "No, this needs more than an okay. I swear that I won't tell anyone except the guards that I can trust." "That's better." "That patient, Gus, he's bitten other people over the last few days. I have a partial list of them. We need to quarantine them, probably against their will. If we don't, this thing gets out in the open. There will be a lot more people who suffer the same fate as that poor nurse who was only doing her job. The guard sat back and thought for a moment. So basically you're asking me to imprison people against their will with no explanation. Yes. He stood and began pacing the room. That sounds an awful lot like a felony. Well, yes it does. The guard continued pacing. And I'm guessing this isn't authorized by administration. Tevis shook his head. So my job could literally be on the line. Tevis nodded. Too bad, I really like this job. Does that mean you'll do it? He reached across the table and offered his hand. Tevis stood and shook it. There's only one more thing that I need to know, Tevis said. Okay. What's your name? The guard chuckled. John Little. You're kidding me. Afraid not, that's my real name. Well, can I call you Little John? Please don't. Tevis laughed. The third floor was supposed to be under construction. The work had been finished some time ago, but the amenities hadn't been installed yet. There were no phones, TVs, or chairs in any of the rooms, just 2 beds and a window. The entire floor was like that, and it was perfect. No one ever came up here. The only problem that Dr. Tevis saw was once somebody would go into quarantine and be strapped to a bed, there was no nurse on duty to check on them. If they weren't infected, he didn't want them starving to death, alone in an empty room, going crazy from boredom. But that was something that he would have to figure out later. Right now, he needed to start tracking people down to even have a quarantine ward. The first person on his list didn't answer their phone. Neither did the second or the third. With each failed call, desperation crept up on him, telling him that it was too late. No one would be quarantined, the virus would spread, and it would be all his fault. He made the next call and was ecstatic when the person answered. Officer Hayden, how can I help you? Officer Hayden, it's Dr. Tevis from the hospital. How are you feeling? There was a slight pause before he answered. Doing good, Doc. What do you need? How's your ear? It's good. Was there something else? Okay, cards on the table. I found out that what Gus has is extremely viral. It can completely take over a human body to the point where the victim becomes a raging, bloodthirsty monster like Gus. Are we talking zombie? Hayden said slowly. Tevis cringed. There was that word again. I prefer to call it an infection, but if calling it a zombie will get you in here for an exam, then fine, he's a zombie. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. You're serious, aren't you? Dead serious. If I let this thing get out in the open unchecked, there's no telling how many people could die. Another long silence. Fine, I'll be in later today so that you can check my ear. Great, Tevis said with a little too much enthusiasm. He hung up the phone and did a fist pump before looking at the next name on the list. There were no more names. He didn't want to quarantine anyone without justification, but he also didn't want to let anyone slip away and become a ticking time bomb, sitting at home waiting to attack unknowing family members and neighbors. He suddenly remembered the waiting room full of people with animal bites. Could that be related? He went from room to room playing the friendly doctor checking on things. For some reason he was greeted with skepticism and even fear. After the third room of people acting like this, he finally asked what was wrong. Is it my breath or something? He joked. The person in the bed hesitated. I don't want to be rude, but honestly, it's your clothes. Tevis looked down and only then realized that he was still covered head to toe in the drying blood of the now dead nurse. Oh, I'm sorry, he said. I've been so busy I didn't even think about changing. If you'll excuse me. He stepped out of the room, mentally chastising himself. No wonder the nurses were also hesitant around him, carrying the blood of their former coworker around and flaunting it in their faces like that. He shook his head as he grabbed a quick shower and a change of clothes in the locker room. Stepping back out into the patient's room 10 minutes later, he asked, "All better?" The woman in the bed smiled. "Much. I'm good, now let's take a look at that injury, he said, putting on gloves and slowly peeling off the gauze. When he got to the skin, he had to suppress a gasp. There were raised blood vessels all around the wound, and they seemed to be spreading. "Oh, that's odd," the woman said. "Is it supposed to look like that?" "Does it hurt?" Tevis said, hoping that his voice wasn't trembling. "Actually, no. Even the bite doesn't hurt. I mean, why is that?" "Oh, I'm not sure," he said, rewrapping it with fresh gauze. "We'll have to run some tests." He finished wrapping and taped it off. "I wanted to ask you about your injury," Tevis said. "What kind of animal was it?" "I'm pretty sure it was a coyote. It was too small to be a wolf and too scraggly to be somebody's pet dog." Tevis took notes. "Well, what happened?" "I had just gone out to get my mail when this thing came at me from out of nowhere and bit me. Luckily, I had gotten a magazine in the mail that I rolled up and smacked it on the nose." "Did it run away?" "Well, no, it kept after me. I had to keep hitting it from having it bite me again as I backed into my house." "Sounds like you were lucky. Where do you live, if you don't mind me asking?" "Oh, I don't mind. You're the first person that I've seen in over an hour. I live out along Route 137 on the way to Haylett." "Oh, out in farm country," Tevis said with a vacant look. "Well, yes. By chance, do you know Gus Swanson?" "Oh yeah, he lives just a half-mile from me. It's such a shame what happened to his family." "What happened?" "Oh, they were killed in a car accident." "Was that the same day that Gus came to the hospital?" "Well, I believe it was." "Thank you so much for your time," Tevis said, jumping up and heading for the door. "What about my arm?" she said, holding up the hastily bandaged appendage. "We're going to take care of that," he said. "In fact, we're going to move you upstairs where we can keep an eye on you." "What does that mean?" she said, but he was already gone. He rushed to the nurse's station. "Okay, listen up," he said to the 4 nurses sitting there on their phones. "We're transferring every case that was an animal bite up to the 3rd floor." "The 3rd floor, but that's unoccupied." "Well, it's about to be occupied. You 3 are to start moving people up there right now. Take any room you want, but at least one of you has to stay up there to monitor the patients and take care of their needs." They all started protesting at once. He held up his hands. "This isn't a debate, it's an order. Also, every patient is to be restrained with at least 2 restraint straps." "Restraint straps?" one of the nurses said. "How do we justify that?" "Tell them it's in case they have a seizure so they don't fall out of the bed." "Are you crazy?" Right now a little, yeah. Oh, and one more thing, your phones, give them to me." "What?" they all said at once. "Give me your phones, all of you." They glared at him, but one by one handed over their phones. He stuck them in his pocket. "You'll get them back at the end of the shift," he said. "This way I know that this job will get done and the lady in room 5 won't be sitting there waiting for an hour for somebody to come take care of her." "We've been busy," one of the nurses said. "I know, that's why I'm taking your phones." He walked out, not seeing but knowing that each of them was giving him the finger. He went to his office and dumped the phones into an empty drawer and then locked it for good measure. He sat behind his desk and called Officer Hayden. He answered on the second ring.
"Officer Hayden, how can I help you?"
"Hayden, it's Tevis."
"I swear to God if you ask me about my dang ear one more time."
Gus Swanson, was his family in the same wreck as him?
"Well, yeah."
What happened to them? Did they go to a different hospital?
"No, they went to the morgue, and both were DOA."
Tevis froze. "How did they die?" he said softly, his eyes wide with fear.
"I'm not sure if I'm authorized."
"Aren't we well past that point?" Tevis said. Hayden sighed.
"The wife died of a fractured sternum that crushed her heart. The daughter died of internal injuries. They also had bite marks on them, but they weren't fatal."
"What were their names?"
Hold on a second."
he said, rifling through some papers.
"Anna Lee and Debeline. But I don't see why this is so important."
Tevis didn't answer. His phone dangled from its cord as he rushed down the hall without closing his door.
Hello?
Hayden said to an empty receiver. Aaron Pebble didn't care much for his job at the morgue. It paid decent, but the first year that he worked there, his stress level was through the roof. Anytime that he was alone in the room where the bodies sat waiting to be disposed of, he was sure that he heard noises. Not just bumps and scratches like rats can make, but sighs and the occasional rustle of plastic. He had learned to ignore it after a while, especially after he started smoking weed before work. Pretty sure that he was smoking weed during work too. No one said anything to him because nobody talked to him at all. Once a body needed pickup, he would get a message on his answering machine in his tiny office, and then he would go get the body and wheel it down to storage. Once a month, the truck would come and take the bodies to wherever dead bodies went to. This hospital didn't have a crematorium, so they had to send them somewhere else. Occasionally, someone would come from a funeral home to get a body, but they didn't really talk much either. Having idle chit-chat over somebody's formerly living body was considered taboo. Aaron knew all about taboo. After a couple of years on the job, he came to the realization that if the bodies were taken from the operating room within a reasonable time and picked up where they needed to be, nobody cared what he did. This led him to some interesting possibilities. He began doing his own examinations, especially on the female bodies. He would open the body bags and examine the breasts very thoroughly. That is, assuming the bodies still had breasts. There were some more violent accidents that made his examinations moot. Sometimes he would do a little further exploring. He kept a drawer full of condoms in his office for such an occasion. Lately, however, the noises he had ignored for years had been getting louder. He still ignored them and took another hit of his forget-about-it medicine, as he called it. But what he couldn't forget about was what he saw with his own eyes. He had just brought a body down from the OR and headed to the storage room. He always kept it dark in there for no particular reason other than they didn't need light and they were dead. He pushed the gurney over to an empty spot and parked it there. As he went back out of the room, he glanced down the row and saw something on the floor. He turned to investigate and found one of the bodies had fallen off of its gurney. He looked around to see if somebody was playing a prank on him. The bodies couldn't just fall off. There were guardrails that stuck up a few inches. It was impossible for a body to just roll off on its own, at least not in a room that had a flat floor where the gurneys weren't rolling around. He stepped up to the body and grabbed it in a fireman's hug. When the body hugged back, Aaron threw himself on the floor and did an amazing backward crab walk, only his was more like a crab run. He backed away so fast that he smacked his head off the wall. He sat there rubbing his head and watching as the body bag writhed around on the floor like a mouse trapped in a snake's belly. This can't be happening, this can't be happening, this can't be happening. Every time that he said it, he wished that he believed it. But there on the floor was the proof. It was happening. The dead were coming back to life. As if to confirm it, another heavy plastic thud sounded a few rows over. Sweat poured down his chubby, pasty face. He heard more movement this time. It was much closer, though. He strained his eyes against the dark, wishing that he had turned the lights on when he came in the room. And then, of course, if he had known what was going to happen, he never would have come into the room at all. In fact, if he had known this was going to happen, he never would have come to work at all. As he wondered where the sound was coming from, a shadow passed over his head. He looked up and the body bag in the gurney beside him was falling in slow motion right on top of him. He screamed like a little girl and kicked at the bag to get it away from him. The bag kicked back, landing a blow to his belly and knocking the wind out of him. He watched in horror as the bag began to rip open. He saw teeth in the small opening as whoever was inside began chewing their way out. Once the hole was big enough, fingers appeared and pried the hole open even bigger. Soon the hole was big enough that a head popped out, followed by the rest of the body of the petite nurse. Her eyes were blood red and she had raised blood vessels all over her body. She shed the body bag and crawled towards the helpless Aaron who was still struggling to breathe. It was the only time in his life that he had ever had a naked woman crawling toward him, and he couldn't even enjoy it because he knew that he was about to die. With no hope and the bloody teeth approaching his face, Aaron knew the only thing that he could do was pray. He didn't close his eyes because, well, dead or not, there was still a naked woman crawling towards him. If he was going to die, he would at least enjoy the view. He started praying the same prayer that everyone prays when they're in desperate trouble. He begged and pleaded for God's help and swore to never again do any of the terrible things that he had done. Suddenly, the doors burst open and the lights came on. Dr. Tevis looked around and saw Aaron on the floor with the nurse about to devour him. He ran up and he kicked her in the head. She flopped over, stunned, as Tevis helped Aaron to his feet. Aaron barely got out. Don't thank me, run, Tevis said, aiming another kick at the nurse as she quickly turned and tried to bite his leg. Aaron started for the door, but Gus's wife and daughter blocked the path. Help me, he said to Tevis, who was busy fighting off the nurse. He turned and saw that they were trapped. 2 naked women were coming at them from one direction, and another coming from the other way. It was Aaron's perfect dream turned into a living nightmare. Tevis started pushing gurneys, turning them into barriers for the women. Aaron pushed some too. They turned them around until they were arm's length away from the women, and they were able to escape back out through the doors. Once out, Tevis leaned against them. Do these doors lock? Tevis said. The light bulb went on in Aaron's head. I'll go get the keys, he said, running away as fast as he could lumber. Tevis watched through the small window in the door as the woman got untangled and charged the door. On the first hit, they nearly knocked Tevis back far enough to escape. Hurry, he yelled down the hallway. After the second hit, a terrible thought struck Tevis. What if this man just ran away to save his own skin? But as if to answer, he reappeared holding a ring of keys. He tried several as the woman continued to attack on the doors, before he finally got them locked. They watched with satisfaction as the doors held securely the next time they tried to get through. Thank you, Aaron said. They stepped back and Tevis offered his hand. You're welcome, he said. I'm sure I don't have to tell you to never open those doors again. Aaron looked at the doors with a tinge of fear. But what about deliveries? I have a truck scheduled for pickup the day after tomorrow. Tevis couldn't believe what he was hearing. No one opens those doors, do you understand me? He said. If those things get out, we're all dead. Aaron looked at the doors again. I understand, he said. No one opens those doors. Tevis gave him a hard stare and then walked down the hallway heading for the elevator. What if I have bodies to put in the room? He called after Tevis. Leave them out in the hallway. Aaron looked at the oversized hallway and wondered if that would work. And make sure you restrain each one with at least 2 straps, Tevis said. What if I run out of straps? Tevis shrugged. Use rope. Aaron thought about where he would find some rope when another question crossed his mind. Who are you? He yelled. I'm the guy trying to keep this thing from spreading. He went back upstairs feeling good about the disaster that had just been averted. Seeing Gus and several other bite victims being moved up to the 3rd floor further boosted his confidence that they might be able to keep this contained. He stopped at the vending machine and grabbed 2 cups of lukewarm vending machine coffee, and then he headed toward Kelvin's office. He had to balance both coffees in one hand while he knocked repeatedly. Finally, a very irritated Kelvin opened the door. What about a closed and locked door, don't you understand? Kelvin said. He handed her a cup of coffee and said, You're welcome, as he went in the lab and plopped in a chair. Come on in, Kelvin said sarcastically. I'm assuming that you're completely fascinated with this virus by now. It's amazing the way it... Have you figured out a way to kill it? Kelvin blinked as if resetting her brain. I'm sorry? Is there a way to kill it? I haven't. Well, that needs to be priority number one, Tevis said. I know you'll be sad to see your little science project go, but we need to have a weapon against it, and it needs to be something that won't kill its human host. Well, that should be easy, she said sarcastically. Why don't you just have me juggle Volkswagens while walking the high wire? As entertaining as that would be to watch, Tevis said, taking a sip of coffee. I think I'd rather you just work on killing the virus. Where am I going to get the victims to test on? Well, I'm glad you asked, Tevis said, leaning back in his chair, realizing just how exhausted he was. They're on their way to the 3rd floor as we speak. I thought the 3rd floor was under construction. It is, I'm just borrowing it for a little while. But does Lower know about that? Nope, and I plan to keep it that way as long as possible. Good luck with that. Tevis didn't answer. Kelvin looked over and his head was leaning against the back of the chair. His mouth was wide open and he was snoring. When Tevis woke, the room was dark. Not completely dark, but enough to make him freak out and try to jump out of the chair. That ended with him falling face forward on the floor as his legs began to wake up. As he lay there helpless, a pair of shoes shuffled slowly into the room. They made their way over to him as Tevis thought of all the different ways that he could defend himself from an attack while laying helplessly face down on the floor and came up empty. A face appeared in front of him. You have a nice nap? Kelvin said. Why did you let me sleep? Tevis said with his mouth smashed against the floor, making him slur. You were tired. You don't really get this whole trying to save humanity thing, do you? Kelvin flipped him over and tried to help him up. It was a struggle, but he was able to get back in the chair. Oh, don't worry, I've been up to the 3rd floor a few times and things are doing all right up there. All right. Well, the nurses are complaining, but that's nothing new. Have you found something? I found several things, but I haven't tried them on people yet because they're highly toxic. What are you waiting for, an engraved invitation? It could kill them, Kelvin said, incredulous. They're dead already, Tevis said with steel in his eyes. The moment that they were bitten, they were dead, they just didn't know it yet. What about the ethical issue of giving patients a potentially deadly substance? No, doctors have been doing that for centuries, Tevis said. If we don't try to give them something that kills the virus, we've failed them anyways, so inaction is still action. Kelvin hung her head. Fine, I have a vaccine that I've made some progress with. Let's go, Tevis said, testing his legs to see if they were awake enough to walk. What, like right now? Or we could just wait until it's too late and try to hide behind ethics while the world literally eats itself. Well, when you put it that way, Kelvin said, gathering up 4 syringes and following Tevis out the door. They walked past the ER waiting room, which seemed to be having a population explosion, on their way to the elevators. Once inside with the doors closed, Kelvin said, Did you see all the patients in the waiting room? Well, yes, I did. Seemed like a lot. Yep. Think it has anything to do with our virus? The elevator stopped on the 3rd floor and the doors opened. I think it has everything to do with our virus, Tevis said, stepping out into pure chaos. There were gurneys loaded with patients lining the walls of 2 or 3 of the wings. The 3rd wing had patients strapped in wheelchairs. They were growling and hissing along with complaining and threats coming from nearly every patient. The entire place smelled like death. Tevis approached the nurses' station trying to get any nurses' attention, but they were all too busy between trying to fill out paperwork just to keep track of where patients were and keeping patients restrained. Along with basic needs like food and water, none of them had a spare moment. From behind him, Tevis heard a woman say, "You!" He turned to see the nurse who had tried to take these shock paddles out of his hands when the petite nurse had died. "Are you happy? Look around at the chaos that you've caused." For the first time, he looked at her name tag that read, Betty. "Betty, I need to find Gus," Tevis said. "You think I know the names of any of these idiots?" "He's the first one that came in," Tevis said desperately. "Big guy, he's the one who killed that nurse. Her name was Karen and you killed her." Tevis hung his head. Look, I'm trying to keep control of the situation. Gus is the key. Do you know where he's at? She glared at him and then started down the main hall. Tevis followed, with Kelvin lagging behind, trying to take in all the craziness around them. They came to the end of the hallway where John, the security guard, was working to keep one of the patients restrained, as she snapped her teeth at him, just missing his arm. Before they got to the room, Tevis knew that it was Gus. The roaring and hissing were louder than any other room. They stepped inside and he had somehow gotten his gurney laying on its side. They started pulling it up to set it upright when Tevis said, "Wait, it'll be easier like this." Kelvin nodded and pulled out one of these syringes and then stuck Gus in the leg with it. "What was that?" Betty said. "Hopefully a cure," Kelvin said. "And you think you can just walk in here and stab my patients with some experimental drug without their consent?" Betty said, a fist balled up, face red. "Oh, you're welcome to unstrap him, hand him a pen and get him to sign a consent form," Tevis said sarcastically. "You know that's illegal." "Well, yes, so is murder." She paused and looked from the now empty syringe to Gus to Tevis. "Justification is a slippery slope," she said. "Tell me again tomorrow if you're not infected with a virus that we don't have a cure for," Tevis said. Kelvin nudged him. "What?" Tevis said, irritated. "Look." Gus was looking back at them, but he wasn't hissing or growling. He was laying there on his side, looking. "I don't believe it," Tevis said. "I'll try not to be too offended by that," Kelvin said as they pulled together to put the gurney back on its wheels. "Mr. Swanson," Tevis said, "can you hear me?" Gus's eyes followed him. It seemed like he was listening and understanding. Even Betty seemed astounded at the change in his behavior. "It's a miracle," she whispered. Tevis smiled at him, and for a moment it looked like Gus had almost smiled back. The corner of his mouth curled up, and then it stopped and went back down. From the back of Gus's throat, a soft growl began to grow louder. "No," Tevis said. Gus hissed at them and snapped his teeth at Tevis, who was standing the closest. "No!" Kelvin put her hand on Tevis's back. "Sorry, I'll try to revise the formula." "No!" Tevis said, whipping around so quickly that Kelvin took a step back. "Try it on another patient. Maybe Gus had a stronger exposure." Okay," Kelvin said. "We can try." All three stepped out of the room and went to another patient that had already turned and gave her the injection. The reaction was the same, a remission for a minute or so, and then the virus had reasserted itself. They tried 2 more times at Tevis's urging. With each additional failure, he became more agitated. "We're so close. Why didn't it work?" "I'll tweak the formula and we'll try again," Kelvin said. "Look around. If we don't do something soon, we'll all be overrun." "We are doing something," Kelvin said, "but we need to get it right and that takes time." "Well, time is one thing we don't have," Tevis said as he started toward the elevator. Betty grabbed his lab coat. "Look, I get what you're trying to do. I didn't really see how committed you were or how hard you've been at it. What I'm trying to say is, I'll do my best to keep things together up here while you figure this out." His face softened into a hint of a smile. "I appreciate it." He gave her shoulder a squeeze and got on the elevator, descending back to square one. When they got to the main floor, Kelvin started toward her lab. "I'll check in on you in a bit," Tevis said over the cacophony of an extremely overcrowded ER. "Where are you going?" Tevis sighed. "To try what will almost definitely fail." "You're going to talk to Laura, aren't you?" Tevis solemnly nodded. "Well, good luck, you'll need it." Kelvin started towards her lab. "Nicole," Tevis said, causing Kelvin to turn around. "Thanks." "For what?" "Believing." Kelvin smiled and gave him a thumbs up and then turned toward her lab. Tevis looked at the massive humanity in the ER and then turned and looked down the empty hallway that led to the admin's office. He sighed and headed down the hallway, passing several signs that said, "Administration, private, no entry." He opened the door that said Stephen Lower, Hospital Administrator, and went inside. The waiting room was decorated nicely, if even a little ostentatious. He could see that it was meant to intimidate anybody entering. "Is Mr. Lower in?" he asked the attractive secretary who looked like she was in her 30s. She darted a worried look toward the interior door that said he was in but didn't want to be disturbed. "I'll check," she said. "He might be on an important call. Have a seat, please." "Thank you," he said, sitting on one of the comfortable couches, but not relaxing too much. He didn't want a repeat of his impromptu nap in Kelvin's office. He could hear the secretary whispering something into the intercom, but couldn't quite make out what she said. She glanced at him and shot him a worried smile as he heard thumps into crash come from the interior office. Tevis sat impatiently, knowing that every second he wasted was another step towards losing control of the situation. Finally, the secretary announced that he could go inside. The interior of the office seemed to be designed to awe and intimidate. The desk that Laura sat behind was massive and a dark color of mahogany. The side walls were filled with pictures of Laura standing beside people and smiling. The people were the main attraction, though. Celebrities, politicians of every level, including a former president. There were generals and admirals and movie stars from films he had seen, and there was one with last year's Nobel Prize winner. The front wall directly behind his desk was covered with degrees and certificates. The lighting was done in such a way to highlight each picture and degree. The overall effect was to make you feel like you were entering the presence of greatness. Fortunately, though, Tevis knew better. Even though he didn't have the full story, he knew that Laura was a big-shot doctor in New York City, living high off the hog as a top-dollar doctor and major mover and shaker in the city that never sleeps. But something had happened. The way he heard it, Lower majorly screwed up and lost his license to practice medicine. His father was very influential and was able to land him a job as a hospital administrator at this hospital in a small town in the middle of nowhere. Tevis knew that Lower wasn't very happy about it. He also knew that he wasn't qualified for the job. But when strings were pulled, logic and common sense took a back seat. That was the way the medical community seemed to work lately. He wasn't entirely sure why that was, aside from greed, but he wished that he could do something to stop it. "Dr. Tevis," Lower said from behind his desk, typing on his computer, desperately trying to look busy. "Mr. Lower," Tevis said, heavily emphasizing the Mr. "What can I do for you?" Lower said, ignoring the emphasis. "As you can see, I'm quite busy." "I need help with a patient." "You should know that I'm no longer a practicing doctor and as such cannot give medical advice." "Well, I know." Lower raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Then why are you here?" "I need you to make a phone call." "For what?" "I have a patient that I can't diagnose." "What are his symptoms?" Lower said, unable to resist a mystery. "He has a fever that we can't control no matter what we do." "You want me to make a call because somebody has a high fever?" "Oh, there's more. The veins have popped out all over the patient, especially his face. It's quite grotesque. And he's become aggressive," Tevis said. "He had an altercation with a nurse yesterday that resulted in her being fatally injured." "He killed a nurse?" "Well, yes." Lower sat back and steepled his fingers. "Then why is he still in my hospital and not in jail?" "And we're still trying to stabilize his condition and ascertain how contagious it is." "Has security been informed at least?" "Yes, they definitely know what happened and the patient is under restraint protocol." "Restraint? And you have a signed consent form for that?" "Well, of course," Tevis lied. "What's the patient's name?" Lower said, showing the first sign of interest since there could be a legal issue. "Gus Swanson." Lower typed on his computer and then frowned at it. "I'm not seeing any consent form." "Really, that's odd. I know that I got one. Maybe the nurses forgot to register it. We've been quite busy today." "I see you've been busy." Laura said, his expression turning dark. Why are there patients on the 3rd floor? Well, we needed the room. Like I said, we've been quite busy. So busy that you made an executive decision without bothering to talk to an executive. There wasn't really time, we were being overrun. By what? Apathy? Tevis took a deep breath. I've been working non-stop to try and contain this situation for the last 2 days. What have you been doing? Tevis' eyes shot to the empty glass with residual amber liquid in it. Lower followed his gaze and quickly slid the glass into a drawer. I'm giving you a direct order to clean the 3rd floor, Lower said. Well, I can't, it's under quarantine. For what? Well, that's the problem, I don't know, Tevis said. That's why I need you to call the CDC. What? The Center for Disease Control in Atlanta. I know what it stands for, Lower growled. Why do you need me to call? Because I have no idea what's wrong with my patient. Well, then get another doctor to look at him. I've consulted with doctors from DC and New York. Lower winced at the mention of New York. And what did all these experts say? Lower said bitterly. Well, they can't figure it out either. It acts like the flu, but the patient's temp runs very high, 102 to 104, and it stays in that range no matter what we do. Try sticking him in the freezer, Lower said sarcastically. We have, no effect. Are you serious? Yeah, that's why I need you to call the CDC. To what end? Lower said. Well, to find out what's wrong with him. I'll tell you what's wrong with him. He has an incompetent doctor that can't recognize a case of rabies. It's not rabies. Lower sat at his computer and pulled up Gus's file. He went in under diagnosis and typed, rabies. Well, there you go, mystery solved. It's not solved, Tevis raged. Just like everything else, you think you can hide here in your ivory tower for a decade or two and retire with a full pension, without ever having to get your manicured hands dirty. Lower picked up the phone but held down the button. Hello, Cindy, give me the CDC, he said mockingly into the dead receiver. Hello, CDC, it seems that we've got us a fella up here in Hickville that has himself a disease. Seeing as how our doctors are just too plumb stupid, could you fly it up here and help us out? Much obliged. Lower replaced the receiver with a smug smile on his face. Oh, there you go, they'll be here in 20 minutes, he said. Tevis looked at him in shock. Do you even know how many people's lives you're playing with? You want to keep him here in a hospital bed and experiment on your lab rat, be my guest, as long as the insurance picks up the bill. But don't go over my head to make decisions and don't call other hospitals. We have a bad enough reputation as it is. Oh, I wonder why, Tevis said, glaring at Lower. Get out, Lower said, and take your sanctimonious attitude with you. Tevis rose and headed toward the door. Once he got there, he stopped. Until his dying day, he couldn't tell you why he did it. Maybe it was petty revenge or just wanting to get in the last word. Whatever it was the worst mistake of his life. Just so you know, Tevis said, Gus doesn't have insurance. Tevis stepped through the door before Lower could say another word. He headed up to the 3rd floor to check on things and was met at the door by John, the security guard. What the heck did you do? John said, stepping in pace beside him as he headed down the packed corridor towards Gus's room. Well, what do you mean? I just got a call from the administrator, John said. Gus is to be released immediately. Crap, Tevis said. Why would he do that? Tevis looked him straight in the eye and said, No clue, but we can't let it happen. How many of those guards you can trust are on shift today? Only me, John said. In fact, there's one of the least trustworthy in front of us. We call him Rambo and not for any good reasons. A little gung-ho? Like you have no idea. Well, great, any ideas? Yeah, I'm working on it. They got to Gus's room and tried to go inside. Stop, the large security guard said. I'm that patient's doctor, Tevis said. I need to check on him. The guard looked at Tevis's name badge. Tevis mentally chided himself for not taking it off. Oh, you're the one Mr. Lower told me to watch for. He said you weren't to be anywhere near the patient, and if you tried to stop me, I was authorized to tase you. Tevis saw the man already had the taser in his hand. Tried to stop you from what? Tevis said. Releasing this patient. Tevis's face went numb from shock. You can't do that. If you do, hundreds, maybe thousands of people will die. Surprisingly, the guard chuckled. Mr. Lower said you would say that. Tevis saw a red beam pointed at him and heard someone scream, when suddenly he felt more pain than he had ever experienced before. It felt like somebody had grabbed him around the midsection with 2 live wires, and then darkness took him. Life in my house had started to become twisted a few months ago. The amount of strange and psychotic incidents that I had dealt with seemed to grow by the day. My 6-year-old daughter Brandy used to be a heavy sleeper before all this started. She would fall asleep on the couch while watching TV, and I would often end up carrying her up to her bed. But lately, she never slept. Every time that I woke up in the master bedroom, I would catch a glimpse of a small face peeking around the door, silently disappearing into the shadows of the house. My wife had the most severe personality changes of all. She wasn't the woman that I married. All of her warmth, compassion, and humanity had suddenly disappeared, leaving some monstrous shell behind. Like my daughter, she never seemed to sleep anymore. She would disappear into the dark forest behind the house at night, wandering in her nightgown barefoot, like a pale ghost disappearing into the mist. One night, I remember waking up from a nightmare. The bathroom light dimly illuminated the master bedroom where I slept. I turned to my wife and found her already awake, staring at me with an insane expression, her eyes bulging out of their sockets. A wide, lunatic grin spread across her face. I sat straight up in bed, my heart palpitating with fear. Is something wrong? I asked, but she continued to stare at me with that inhuman expression, her eyes gleaming. Emma, are you okay? I felt something wet and sticky soaking into my t-shirt. I looked down in the bed and saw a freshly dead possum laying between us, its head twisted around, its torso sliced down the middle, intestines spilled out onto the sheets, staining them. The smell of blood and death hit me all at once, and I jumped out of bed without another word, grabbing new clothes and running to the bathroom. I locked myself in, hyperventilating for a few moments, and then I managed to calm myself down. I checked the lock again, and then I stripped naked and took a long shower, wiping the blood off my skin over and over. No matter how much soap I used, I still felt stained. When I was done, I opened the door a tiny crack and peered through. The bedroom looked empty. I had no idea where my wife was, and I didn't care. I quickly ran to the guest bedroom, locking the door behind me. And for the last couple months, I've slept there every night. A can of police mace on the nightstand next to the bed, a brand new deadbolt on the door. The next morning, I met my friend Richie at a local diner. I had called off sick from work, and as I sat in the booth waiting for him to arrive, my hands shook uncontrollably. I spilled coffee on the table and on myself more than a few times. I hadn't slept since the incident, and was only running on a couple of hours. I saw Richie arrive striding through the front door. He wore a t-shirt to show off the tattoos on his arms. With his dirty blonde hair and blue eyes, he had a very Irish cast to his face. He sat down across from me, looking me up and down quickly and frowning slightly. He saw all of the spill marks on the table, the napkins that I had used to do a bad job of cleaning it up, my trembling hands and sunken, tired eyes. I'm sure I was quite the sight. "What's up, Thorne?" he asked, simply, not smiling. Like a lot of my friends, he always called me by my last name, rather than by Julius. I shook my head. "I don't know, man," I said. "Some weird stuff has been going on. Like, really weird. I'm scared, man, I really am." He nodded. Yeah, I can tell. You know that I'm always here for you. Whatever you need, just call me. Thanks, I said, trying to smile slightly. Now, why don't you just tell me what's been going on, he said. I'm all ears. Tell me everything and maybe we can figure out something. At that moment, the waitress came, taking our orders and bringing Richie some coffee. Once she had left, I told him everything that had happened. I didn't leave out a single detail. By the time that I was done, our breakfast had arrived and we were both on our third cups of coffee. I still felt drained, however. The caffeine seemed to make me feel more tired, if anything. Huh, Richie said thoughtfully, eating a piece of bacon off his plate. He stared across the room, his eyes looking 1,000 miles away, deep in thought. That is weird. I think it's more than weird. It's psychotic. I'm scared to go home. I'm scared to be in the same room with my own wife and daughter. Yeah, he said, nodding, chugging the rest of his burning hot coffee in one long swallow. It is. Psychotic, I mean. What do you think's happening? The question caught me by surprise, and I choked on my coffee, coughing. Me? I asked. I have no idea what's happening. All I know is that my wife and daughter have turned into lunatics. If it was just one of them acting weird, maybe I would think it was some mental illness, schizophrenia or something. He smiled slightly at that, but his eyes remained grave. I think the seriousness with which he took the situation freaked me out nearly as much as the situation itself. But it's not one, it's both, he pointed out. And yet, not you. You seem totally fine. So what's your point? I asked. Well, if it was some sort of strange drug in the water, all three of you should be affected. You all eat and drink the same stuff, right? I nodded. And if it was mental illness, likely it would only be one of your family members affected. I mean, what are the chances that two people would develop a serious psychotic disorder at the exact same time? And schizophrenia is extremely rare in children anyways. So what does that leave? I asked. He shrugged. I don't know, maybe body snatchers? Aliens, mad scientists cloning people in secret government labs. Who knows? I laughed at that. Hearing it put into words made it sound totally insane. Aliens, body snatchers, I said, scoffing. Yeah, that's all science fiction crap. This is real, man. It's real and I don't know what to do. You should leave your house immediately. Come stay with me for a couple of days, Richie said. I shook my head. I can't just leave my family behind, I said, realizing how feeble the argument sounded. I had just said these people weren't my family after all, but Richie understood. You mean you can't leave until you find out what might have happened? He asked. My head slumped, all the tiredness and fear from the past few weeks leaving me lethargic and bone-tired. I just can't leave, I said again, feeling like a prisoner. Things began to get stranger after that. Pets began to disappear all across the neighborhood. I would see signs for missing dogs and cats. Normally, Emma would have become despondent over this. She was an animal lover who often donated to charities for homeless or abandoned pets. She had an ASPCA sticker on her car. But as I knew early on in my heart, it was not Emma that I was living with anymore. During the first days, I thought that perhaps some toxin in the food or water had caused brain damage and personality changes in my family. Maybe it was an intentional release of some chemical weapon agent by the government or a terrorist organization. All of these thoughts passed through my head, but my intuition told me over and over that they were all dead ends or red herrings. The truth was, these people were not my family, and I knew it in my heart from the very beginning. I could see it in the way that their eyes gleamed during the night as they crept around the house, never sleeping, moving as silently as cats stalking their prey. I would hear floorboards creak outside the door as one or maybe both of them stood there for hours on end in the middle of the night, and my heart would begin beating fast. Dark bags began to form under my eyes as I slept less and less. The only release that I had was work, but every night I would have to come back to these people who I didn't know, but who looked identical to my family.
I lost weight from the stress and I began to smoke heavily. Normally, Emma hated it when I smoked and she never allowed smoking in the house. But now I chain smoked inside and she didn't even seem to notice. She and Brandy barely talked anymore, even to each other. When they did speak, their sentences were short, clipped, and often bizarre. A month ago, I was sitting up in the guest bed, smoking and reading some Philip K. Dick. I had the 3 Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch in my hands, which ironically was a story about a man who had been replaced by an advanced alien civilization. It struck too close to home, and I put the book down just staring out the window, the dim lamp that I kept on through the night giving the room a yellow glow. And then I saw her. My wife was creeping out the basement door barefoot, an insane smile plastered across her face. Her wide eyes looked around. She looked like a maniac who was trying to keep herself from descending into uncontrollable laughter. I wonder what they find so amusing. I whispered to myself bitterly, feeling cold hatred and spite towards these 2 strange people who had taken over my house. I saw her start towards the woods beyond the house, taking a small dirt trail that ran towards a nature reserve a mile away. And at that moment, totally fed up and ready for this madness to end, I resolved to follow her. I got up out of bed, wincing as the springs groaned. I wondered if my daughter would be waiting outside the door with a bloody knife in her hands, ready to cut me open like what my wife did to that possum. I heard a floorboard creak directly outside my door and a slight, barely audible sound followed it. It sounded like giggling, a little girl quietly laughing. I swore under my breath. "Screw it," I whispered, going to the window and opening it. The wood shrieked loudly and I winced looking back over at the door. But I heard no response from the other side. "You're afraid of a little girl finding out that you're leaving. You're a grown man," I asked myself, smiling at the absurdity of it. But when I remembered Brandy's cold and insane eyes, the smile went away. Yes, indeed, I was afraid of that little girl. I had no idea what she was capable of. I looked down. I was only on the 2nd story and below the window was soft earth and grass. I slowly climbed out, hanging myself down from the window and letting myself drop. I felt myself falling for a few moments and I wondered if I would regret this. Images of my leg bone breaking and poking out through the skin ran through my head. And then I hit the ground, rolling as I hit the dirt. I landed hard on my back, knocking the wind out of my lungs. I lay there for a few seconds, breathing hard, and then I pushed myself up and began following my wife, wearing only slippers and boxers and a t-shirt. I wasn't exactly dressed for reconnaissance work, but then again, neither was she. I glanced at the house and from my daughter's window, I thought that I saw a small face staring down at me, grinning like a jack-o'-lantern, an expression of barely contained glee and bloodlust marring her childish face. But when I looked back up, the window was empty. I figured my mind must be playing tricks on me, and yet it shook me so badly. I had never imagined that I could be so afraid of a little girl as I was right then. I tried to move as fast as I could without making noise, hoping that I could catch up with my wife. The half moon gave some bare light that streamed through the trees. I used it to avoid the rocks and tree roots that jutted up out of the earth. After a few minutes, I heard an eerie sound coming from in front of me. Humming. I caught a glimpse of my wife, pale and white, her nightgown billowing around her thin frame. She stared straight ahead, her eyes not seeming to blink. She veered off the trail and I followed from a safe distance, trying to keep myself hidden behind trees. It felt like dozens of eyes watched my every movement, but I brushed it off as paranoia. She trampled through brush and pricker bushes, not seeming to notice the thorns and whipping branches. I tried to avoid the obstacles while still keeping her in view. We went uphill for a while, and to me, her choice of direction seemed totally random. And then she stopped. The humming cut off in mid-note, and she knelt down, sighing in pleasure. She began to play with something white laying on the ground under a small pile of leaves and brush. She carefully brushed the remnants of disintegrating leaves and soil off the object. From behind the tree, I couldn't see what it was. She ran it through her fingers, stroking it lovingly, even kissing it. After it felt like an eternity, she put it back down, turning around to start back towards the house. She passed within 20 feet of me. I hid behind the largest tree in the immediate area, moving behind the trunk as she passed, praying that no twigs would snap and give away my presence. None did, and I watched her descend into the fog in the trees. As soon as I was sure she was gone, I crept forwards towards the spot that I had seen Emma crouching. A bone lay there thin and long, still covered in small pieces of rotting flesh. In horror, I knelt down examining it closer. It looked too large to be an animal bone, though perhaps it could have come from a deer. Underneath, I saw the earth had recently been disturbed. It looked as if it had been dug up and filled back in. I went back to the house and grabbed a shovel from the shed, determined to solve this mystery. The dark house loomed over me, the windows looking down on me like pupils, hiding what laid behind it. When I got back to the side of the bone, I started digging. The earth was soft and fresh, and it didn't take long to get a large hole started. But I found nothing for the first half hour. And covered in sweat and breathing heavily, I took a break and then returned to the task. Once I had gotten down about 5 feet, I saw something besides dirt and small stone. At first I couldn't tell what it was, but it emanated a fluorescent, day-glow color. And then with horror, I realized it was my daughter's favorite t-shirt. I kept pulling dirt off and soon found 2 bodies in the pit. It was Emma and Brandy, their throats cut wide open, their staring eyes covered in dirt. I turned and vomited on the forest floor, feeling that I might collapse at any moment. Waves of hopelessness, confusion, and anger consumed me in turn. Staggering, I ran out of the woods, going to a neighbor's house and frantically knocking on the door. It was 3 a.m. and it took a while to get a response, but finally my neighbor, an old retired man, came to the door. "Al, thank God," I said. His tired, bloodshot eyes looked at me for a long time. "Julius, it's a bit late for a visit," he said. "This is an emergency. Can I use your phone for a minute? I need the police here immediately." His eyes widened at that, and he looked wide awake a moment later. Sure, come on in," he said. As soon as I had entered, he closed and locked the door behind me. He pointed towards the kitchen. "The phone's in there, hanging on the wall next to the door." I thanked him profusely, visions of my murdered family members running through my head. And then I dialed the police, my fingers shaking so badly that it took me a few tries. Finally, though, I heard it begin ringing, and at that moment, I wondered what exactly I would say. The 911 operator assured me that vehicles were en route and that I should stay at the house with my neighbor Al until they made sure the area was safe. Under no circumstances should I go outside until the police arrived. It all sounded normal and sensible at the time, and I had no suspicion that things would become nightmarish and lethal within minutes. Al had listened to me frantically try to describe the situation to the 911 operator with wide eyes, his wrinkled old face showing fear and confusion. He had a cup of coffee in his hand, but he never drank any of it. "Is that true?" he asked after I hung up. "Brandy and Emma, they're dead. You found their bodies in the forest." I nodded grimly. I hadn't told the 911 operator about the doppelgangers in the house or the bizarre and psychotic behavior. I figured once the police saw the bodies, my story would become a lot more believable. But I didn't want to sound like a lunatic over the phone, lest the police come and think that I was some delusional maniac who had just murdered my own wife and daughter and was trying to cover my own butt by calling and reporting it. I had watched more than enough true crime shows to know that whenever a wife or husband is murdered, their spouse is always the first suspect until cleared by forensics or an alibi. It seemed like no time passed when I heard tires screeching outside and vehicles pulling up in a frenzy. I looked outside expecting to see police lights flashing, wondering why no sirens had sounded. My heart leaped into my throat when I saw 3 black SUVs filled with men in suits. They got out holding automatic rifles. Without warning, they pointed the guns at the house and began firing, 15 dark silhouettes lined up and down the street outside, looking like a firing squad at a military execution. When the first bullets exploded through the wall, I was so surprised that I didn't even move. I saw Al standing there with his mouth hanging open as a bullet shattered his coffee cup, sending the steaming hot black liquid all over the floor, yet missing his hand entirely. A second later, another one came in and exploded through his chest. In slow motion, I saw a flower of blood blossom out from the gaping hole that suddenly appeared in the center of his heart. He didn't so much as cry out, but instead fell back instantly, moving his hands up as if in supplication as he clenched and unclenched his fingers. His mouth opened and closed silently as a puddle of blood rapidly spread out beneath him on the linoleum kitchen floor. And then my instinct kicked in. As glasses shattered and dishes exploded and light bulbs burst all around me, I jumped to the floor, crawling towards the back door, making myself as small a target as possible. At that moment, I didn't even realize that I had dragged myself through the warm, sticky mess pooling beneath Al's still body. His pupils dilated in death and his mouth opened in surprise. The blood completely covered my white shirt and blue jeans. I dragged my arms and hands through it as light after light went out, each bulb exploding in turn as gunfire strafed across the house over and over, left to right and then right to left, and then left to right again. After it felt like an eternity, the shooting stopped. I had nearly reached the back door by this point. I also looked like a serial killer with my clothing, shoes, and skin mostly covered by Al's blood. It made me feel sick to my stomach, and a part of me wanted to rip the soiled clothes off and throw them to the side as I went. I jumped up, flinging the door open and running out into the dark night beyond. Behind me, I heard the front door smash open as the men kicked their way inside. The last thing that I heard from that house was them running from room to room yelling, "Clear!" And then I reached the border of the forest and I was quickly swallowed up in the shadows of the trees. As I wandered blindly through the trees in mortal terror, covered in goosebumps and sweating heavily, I heard the men destroy the back door of the house. They had apparently cleared the house and realized that I was no longer inside. Reality felt like a nightmare, disassociated and surreal. I couldn't believe that any of this was happening, but my instincts took over, and with high amounts of adrenaline surging through my blood, I ran like I never had before. The men began to come out into the forest, sprinting, turning on bright LED lights attached to the ends of their rifles. I had the advantage in that I knew these woods well. The men certainly had me beat on physical strength and stamina though. They all looked like gym rats, their muscles bulging under their black suits, their thick bodies striding forward with purpose. They all stood tall and still for a moment as their cold killer's eyes surveyed the surroundings, reptilian and emotionless. I heard more SUVs coming to a screeching halt in front of my house, and soon the sound of many dogs barking echoed across the forest. I knew they were tracking me and they would soon find me and kill me. No one would ever know what had happened here, least of all me, and no one would ever be able to prevent it from happening again, with the destruction of the sole living witness to the bizarre replacement of my family. I ran towards a large rock formation that I knew nearby, with small indentions allowing a man to fit in the wide crack of the 30-foot-tall cylinders of stone. This was a place that I'd like to come and sit during happier times, sometimes just meditating and listening to the sound of the birds and breathing in the clean air of the woods. Now I hoped in my time of desperation that it would come to my aid again. I heard the dogs getting closer and saw the lights separate into smaller and smaller groups as the agents combed every inch of the forest, sweeping their rifles up to down and left to right as they looked into every crevice and behind every tree. I saw a single light drawing nearer. My heart seemed to stop. I knelt down low, feeling the ground with my trembling fingers. I found a large, flat stone that must have weighed a good 10 pounds. Making myself as small a target as possible, I waited for the figure to pass right by my hiding spot. Even though this happened a couple of months ago now, I still remember the rising waves of anxiety that gripped my heart as this assassin stood before me. As soon as the light began turning to examine the dark corners of the indention I crouched in, I sprang forwards, waves of adrenaline giving me amazing strength and reflexes. The man saw me at the last moment, his eyes widening as his finger began to tighten on the trigger, and then I smashed the rock into the front of his skull. His neck twisted to the side, his eyes instantly drooping as his body went slack. I dropped the rock onto the leaf-strewn ground and caught him in the same movement, dragging his limp body back into the shallow groove of the rock where I hid. I took the rifle off of him, flicking off the light and feeling around in his belt for extra magazines of ammunition. I found 3 extra clips. I fumbled around until I found a latch to release the magazines, unclipping them one after another and shoving them into my pockets. The man quickly started to stir, groaning and moving his head slowly from side to side, his eyes still clenched shut. "Ugh," he mumbled, his eyes beginning to flutter. "My head, Jesus, what?" His blue eyes suddenly opened, and he looked directly at me, an icy hatred changing his expression in a single moment. "No, it's you, Julius Thorne." He spat my name with venom, staring directly at me, even as blood trickled down his cheeks from his forehead. "Yeah, it's me," I said. "What is going on right now? Why did you psychopaths murder my neighbor and try to kill me?" He just shook his head and kept his mouth tightly shut. I waited a few seconds, giving him a chance to answer. When I realized that he wasn't planning on talking, I sighed, steeling myself for what I knew I had to do. Raising the rifle up above my head, I quickly brought down the butt of the gun into the center of his nose. I heard it crunch, a fountain of blood exploding from the front of his face. He started to open his mouth to scream, but I turned the gun around and pointed it straight at his right eye. "If you scream, I'll kill you right here," I said. "I have nothing to lose right now, and I'd rather go down fighting." He bit his lips so deeply that a small trickle of blood began to stream down his chin, but he didn't scream or cry out, despite the immense pain that he looked to be in. "Now maybe we can try this again," I said, giving him a grim smile. "Why did you guys want to kill me? Why are you chasing me?" "We are agents who've been tasked with detecting and destroying anomalies that have arisen across the United States," he said, scowling at me with hatred, his words coming out somewhat distorted as he constantly spat blood. "And people usually call us the cleaners. Mostly we deal with incidents in small towns like this one, though sometimes it hits the fan in the cities too. Just last week we had a werewolf in New York City. Press thought that it was some serial killer who ripped apart his victims with a knife. But any coroner worth his salt would immediately be able to tell that it had actually been claws and fangs. But we found him and brought him in for containment. He had already killed 3 joggers and 7 homeless people by then." "Yeah, so what does any of that have to do with me?" I asked, furious. I hated these men so badly at that moment. I had asked for help, and instead, assassins had come to my side. "Your wife and daughter are dead," he replied, "but you're not the first one to call and say that you found the grave of your family. In every other case, the police found the people still alive and healthy in the house, and the graves totally empty by the time that we got there. But there were always indications that the individuals still living had changed, and they always began to show psychotic and violent behavior, and inevitably they would kill their own family members and neighbors, anybody in the area. When the anomaly is allowed to proceed, the entire town often ends up being destroyed. We lost over 10,000 people in a single incident last year, so we come in and contain it by killing anyone associated with the anomaly, to stop it from spreading. Because it does spread, and it seems to spread by association. It starts with a couple people on a street and then the rest of their house, and then their next door neighbors, and it keeps going outwards like ripples spreading outwards in a pond. By this point, I heard dogs getting closer and closer, and I saw lights flashing through the trees in the distance aimed in my direction. I quickly ripped a strip of fabric from the agent's shirt and tied his hands and feet before binding his mouth so that he couldn't scream. I knew they would still probably find him within 10 minutes or so, but that might be all I needed to get out of here, and now at least I had a gun. I sprinted out of the woods, taking the trail in the opposite direction of the agents. I had to move in the dark, which slowed me down significantly, but I had been on these trails 1,000 times before. Soon the shouting of the men and the barking of the dogs grew faint behind me, and I came out on an empty side road. I knew the area well. Richie lived only a few blocks from here. Without thinking, I began to stagger down the road, the streetlights flashing on and off above me. I saw faces peering out of windows as I passed. I must have looked like a madman, being totally covered in blood with wide and panicked eyes that constantly snapped in the direction of the smallest sound. Yet amazingly, not a single person came out of their house. I wondered how many of the faces were just those who were replaced, doppelgangers with the right human skin, but without any of the human mind, except maybe for its most destructive and insane impulses. Within minutes, I found myself stumbling through Richie's front yard towards his little ranch house, a massive wraparound porch with pillars painted white in front of the light blue siding. He had Halloween decorations all over the place. A scarecrow was crucified in the front yard, fake blood streaming from its hands and feet. A massive painting of a reptilian humanoid with black shining skin and tentacles coming out of its mouth stood in front of the porch, like some nightmare from an H.P. Lovecraft story. Fake gravestones were lined up row after row of gray foam with skeletal hands rising out from the grass in front of them. I saw plumes of smoke rising from a chimney connected to the fireplace, the smell of wood smoke and decaying autumn leaves mixing in a pleasant scent that always reminds me of Halloween. I pounded on the door until Richie came and opened it. His eyes widened as he saw me. "My God, Thorne, what happened?" he asked. I moved past him, looking back furtively at the streets and the dark forest stretching out before us. Hidden dangers seemed to be everywhere. "Close the door," I told Richie. He quickly shut it and turned the deadbolt. He turned to me, his face pale, a shocked expression on it. "Are you hurt? Whose blood is that? Is that yours?" he asked. "No," I said curtly, shaking my head. "I don't have time to explain it all now. Some men are after me. I think they're from the government. My neighbor is dead and my family's dead." I broke down then, crying. "I need help. I really need your help right now." Okay, I believe you," he said reassuringly, putting a hand on my shoulder. "It's gonna be okay. That's a nice gun, by the way." He gave me a calming smile. I had nearly forgotten about the automatic rifle slung around my shoulder. I looked down at it with a blank expression, like I had just discovered a new limb on my body. "Hey, how about we get you a change of clothes and then we'll figure out what to do," he said. "Hey, come with me to my room. I think you're about my size." I gratefully followed him. He gave me an old shirt and hoodie and a pair of jeans. I stripped off my bloody clothes, feeling how the drying, coagulating blood crackled under my dirt-stained fingers as I stripped. I felt a small sense of hope as I put on the clean clothes. I had my friend here with me now. I had escaped. I wasn't alone in this anymore, at least. At that moment, I heard a knock at the front door. It sounded light and hesitant, like the knocking of a small child. I walked quickly out of the room and saw Richie standing there, the front door standing wide open, a nightmarish shape standing on the porch. It looked like a person, but deep, blackened burns covered every inch of their skin. Only their eyes still had any humanity left. Two shining pits of despair with green irises and massively dilated pupils. They constantly teared up and rolled from side to side in agony. The person held out their arms in front of them, as if they were in so much pain that they didn't even want their arms to touch their body. I couldn't tell the race or gender of the person through the immense damage to their body. Yellowish fluid mixed with bright trails of blood seeped from cracks in its destroyed skin. It constantly moaned. The weeping wounds all over its body cried constantly, and the smell of smoke and gasoline radiated off the dying person on the porch. The figure said. "Oh God, help please." "Oh my God," Richie said, putting his hand over his mouth. "We need an ambulance here immediately." He furiously checked his pockets, and then he spun, his eyes in a blind panic. "My phone's upstairs. We need to call 911 right now." "No, Richie," I screamed. "When I called 911, those men came and tried to kill me. They're not on our side." I wish that I had more time to explain. Richie heard the note of panic in my voice. His face was covered in a sheen of sweat, and the anxiety I felt seemed to reflect in his expression. "Well, we have to do something," he said, a pleading tone in his voice. He looked like he wanted to turn away and run from the whole situation, but then he stopped and stared at the figure more closely. "Oh Jesus, is that you, Melissa?" With those words, my heart jumped into my throat. I turned to the figure with newfound horror. Melissa and Richie had dated for nearly a year. Looking closer at the figure, I could see that it did appear to be a woman, at least as far as I could tell from the curve of the body under the blackened skin. Melissa was white and thin, about 5'6". This thing with third-degree burns all over its body was certainly the right height and build. "It hurts," she said, her voice gurgling and loud. "Oh, it hurts so bad. Kill me, please kill me." She waved her arms as if trying to cool them with the autumn air. "That's it, I'm calling an ambulance," Richie said, running past me. I followed closely behind him, leaving the door wide open. We went upstairs and he pulled his phone from its charger and opened it, dialing 911. He frowned, listening for what seemed like a long time, and then he gave me the phone. As I pressed it to my ear, I heard an emotionless message read by a robot with a woman's voice coming through.
"Stay in your homes until the situation is resolved. Thank you for your help in this trying time."
And then it began to repeat, starting at the beginning.
"This is a recording. Emergency services in your area have been temporarily suspended. Help is on the way. Under Executive Order 718, martial law has been declared in your area. Until it arrives, please keep your doors locked and windows closed. Stay in your homes until the situation is resolved."
"What the heck is this?" Richie said, infuriated. "What do they mean emergency services are temporarily suspended?" "Why don't we take her straight to the hospital?" I asked. His eyes brightened at this. "Yeah, let's do it. What other choice do we have? She needs help immediately and she's going to die without it," he said gloomily, his eyes growing moist. "But the phone says to stay inside." "I really hate to say it, but I think she's going to die regardless," I said. "Nobody can survive third-degree burns over the vast majority of their body." We moved back downstairs, the phone in Richie's hand. As we came down the stairs, we saw that the front door still stood open. Melissa was gone. I ran forward, seeing drops of blood and pus on the deck where she had stood. Yet there was no sign of her. Where could she have gone? She couldn't have walked that far in her condition. I was amazed that she was still conscious at all. She must have been in some of the worst pain imaginable. I saw a figure walking up the porch stairs. I sighed, thinking that Melissa had come back, and she had in a way. She stood before us now, fully healed, her clothes new and unburnt. She had an ear-to-ear grin across her face and she kept one hand behind her back. "Richie," she said slowly as if tasting the word. "Oh, Richie, I'm so happy to see you. A lot of strange things have happened tonight." Richie's eyes glistened as tears began to slide down his face. "Melissa?" he said, his voice cracking. "Oh my God, Melissa, it's really you, isn't it?" "Of course it is, baby," she said, moving a lock of blonde hair out of her face with her left hand. Her right stayed behind her back, though. She talked like Melissa, and she even seemed to have some of her mannerisms, but in her wide and staring eyes, there was a look of bloodlust and lunacy. "Richie, stay the heck back," I said. "That is not Melissa." But he ran forward crying, his arms outstretched. I don't even know if he heard what I had said. As he crossed the threshold of the door, Melissa pulled her hand from behind her back, revealing a huge, blood-stained butcher's knife. Raising it high, she ran forward, her eyes as cold as the vast empty spaces between worlds. My hands reacted without my brain even comprehending what they were doing, raising the gun high and pointing it at her chest. I saw the knife coming down as if in slow motion, and then thick drops of blood splashing in the air as bullets ripped through her stomach and heart. She jerked backwards, the knife rising back up as her arm spasmed. Stumbling, she stepped forward, slashing at the air 6 inches in front of Richie's neck, with all of her strength before falling face first on the porch. Richie hadn't even reacted as the knife whizzed in the air towards his body. He stood shell-shocked and dazed, like a victim from a war zone. So did I, except with a smoking gun in my hands. Screaming began to emanate all up and down the street as people started running out of their houses. For a couple of seconds I thought that everybody had simply reacted to the sound of gunshots. Perhaps some of them had even seen me kill Melissa. Though if they had, they would have known my actions were clearly taken in self-defense. She still clutched the knife tightly in her right hand, her eyes bulging from their sockets, the maniacal grin eternally etched across her thin, pretty face in a grisly death mask. I quickly realized the other people on the streets were not coming out to investigate gunshots, but instead running for their lives. I saw men, women, and children chased by family members wielding knives, axes, and guns. Across the street from Richie's house, I saw a little girl no older than 10, running in her bright yellow SpongeBob pajamas. The mother, an overweight woman with greasy black hair, held a blood-stained samurai sword above her head, breathing heavily as she sprinted after her daughter with murder in her eyes. Under the harsh glare of the streetlights, she looked surreal, like a villain from a cartoon. "Mommy, no!" the girl shrieked, flailing her arms in front of her as she ran, as if she hoped an invisible guardian angel would grab her and carry her away. "Daddy, help me!" But I had a feeling that her dad was not coming, based on the amount of blood already on the murder weapon. Richie and I began to run towards the girl, but the mother closed the distance quickly, her nightgown flying furiously around her waist. Her eyes wild, a twisted grin marring her pale face. She raised the sword, bringing it down on the back of the girl's leg. With a squeal of agony, the girl fell forward, her pajamas quickly turning crimson with the blood streaming down her leg. She began to crawl away, weeping and shrieking for her father. Behind her, the mother raised the sword again, intending to strike the killing blow. With the girl on the ground, I had a clear shot now. I had been tempted to try to take her out earlier, but the girl had stood right between me and her mother, and I feared that I would kill them both if I fired. Now, I had the mother right in my sights, the lunatic gleam in her dark eyes making her seem somehow inhuman, even alien. I squeezed the trigger, watching her head explode in a shower of hair, skin, and bone splinters as a short burst of 3 or 4 bullets exploded out the end of the barrel. Her headless body stood there for a few moments, holding the bloody sword high, the neurons still firing in a body that didn't realize that it had lost its life yet. She staggered forwards, falling towards her daughter, the spurting stump of her neck soaking the girl in her mother's blood. The girl continued to crawl away from this nightmarish figure that had once been her mother. Running forwards, Richie grabbed the girl, carefully lifting her up behind her knees and shoulders. I covered them as mayhem broke down on all the street, continuously moving the barrel of the automatic rifle in the direction of any nearby sounds, ready to fire at a moment's notice. Most of the houses were spaced a few 100 feet apart, with thick forests that stretched behind them for miles. Further down the street, I saw chaos and bloodshed as deranged family members murdered their own sons and daughters, their own mothers and fathers, littering the street with corpses. Pain-filled screams shattered the silence of the night, echoing and distorting as they mixed into a nightmarish cacophony. Even months later, I still hear them when I'm falling asleep, the horror-filled cries of children in their last moments. We ignored the bloodshed and ran back towards the house. The girl's blood dripped all down Richie's arms. She moaned and kept rolling her head, eventually letting it settle against Richie's chest. And then she went quiet, her eyes closing, a peaceful look coming over her face. We ran through the open door. Richie took the girl into the kitchen, putting her on the table. I stayed behind, locking the door before also engaging the deadbolt. I turned around, assessing the damage. The girl's eyes stayed closed as Richie took off her pajama bottoms. We both had college degrees and a great deal of theoretical knowledge on many subjects, but neither of us had any real experience in assessing or dressing wounds. I took out my phone, instinctively going to YouTube to type it in. How to give someone stitches, but I noticed that my internet was down. All phone calls and text messages refused to go through. Apparently they had taken down all cell service as well as revoking emergency services. Okay, I said, we have no internet, so we're going to have to do this blind. I don't think it's that difficult. I think you know more about this than I do, Richie said. You always loved anatomy and dissections and all that. I nodded grimly. I went and washed my hands while Richie grabbed a box of latex gloves from a kitchen drawer. I walked back to the girl and started to clean the area with paper towels, a bowl of water and a clean rag sitting next to the prone figure on the table. Soon the water had turned to bright red as I used the rag to clean the blood off her skin. I could see that the wound hadn't hit any vital areas. I saw no severed blood vessels spurting bright red blood in time with her heartbeat, and the bleeding had already started to slow. I sighed in relief at our small bit of luck. It looks a lot worse than what it is, I said. The sword had cut into the muscle somewhat, but it missed all the major arteries and veins in the area. She might have a hard time walking, but I think that as long as we clean and bandage it properly, she should be fine. Assuming that she gets out of here alive, Richie pointed out. I nodded. He went and grabbed a sewing kit from his living room, something that Melissa had left behind. From the garage, he got a length of fishing line. After sterilizing the needles and fishing line and cleaning the wound with alcohol, I threaded it and began to stitch the girl's skin back together. The girl still lay on the table, catatonic and pale. Richie and I sat in the living room unsure of what to do next, waiting for her to wake up from her catatonic state. You know what I think? Richie asked. No, but I'm sure you're about to tell me, I said, glancing out the window. Richie's eyes gleamed, his hand shaking. I couldn't tell if it was terror or excitement. You know how the Bible sounds totally nuts, at least the Old Testament part, where they talk about how all women came from a man's rib, and how there were only two people and everybody is descended from their children's incestuous coupling. I nodded. This was a topic that Richie had gone at a length about before. I knew where he was going to try to steer the conversation. I sighed, looking out the window again. Other than the dozens of bloody bodies strewn across the street, everything looked idyllic. Just another peaceful street in a small American town. Yeah, and you think it has something to do with aliens, right? I said. He nodded quickly and gesticulating crazily with his hands now. I mean, yeah, think about it. A woman coming from a man's rib. That doesn't even make sense. Unless, he put his finger up, it was some sort of genetic engineering. Perhaps they wanted his bone marrow for its DNA. You don't need to take out somebody's rib to get their DNA, I retorted. You can literally get DNA from any part of their body, except the red blood cells, of course. He looked at me quizzically. I forgot just how much you know off the top of your head sometimes, he said, shaking his head. Why not the red blood cells? Because they lose the nucleus when the progenitor cell creates them, so they have no DNA and no nucleus. I thought that I saw a shadow flicker across the street, but when I turned my head I saw just shadows. A flag waved lazily in the front yard. Well, anyways, they might have had a reason for using the bone marrow for genetic engineering. Why do you think Adam and Eve's great-grandkids weren't deformed mutants or babbling idiots? Richie asked. I don't know, you tell me, I answered. I'm assuming it's because the story is a load of BS. He smiled at this. Because the kids were genetically engineered too, and probably the grandkids and so on. The aliens likely kept changing each individual's genetic code, so these few people could reproduce with their own siblings, without harmful effects to the children. They probably engineered all the different races too. They made the two genders, so why not? Richie explained enthusiastically. I had to give him credit. The whole idea made sense in a weird kind of way. And another weird thing, Richie said, is that you can make a woman from a man but not a man from a woman. To make a woman from a man's DNA, all you need to do is remove the Y chromosome and duplicate the X chromosome, right? But you can't make a man from a woman's DNA because the Y chromosome would be entirely missing. The Y chromosome would have to be synthetically engineered from nucleotides, which would pose a huge problem, much harder than just replicating the X chromosome. There's no way the people who wrote the Bible could have known any of that. I think what's going on now is just demonic, I replied. Aliens wouldn't come all the way here just to take a random monkey and engineer it into the human species. And they wouldn't care about replacing people. What kind of sense would that make? But in hindsight, even though both of us were wrong, I think Richie was much closer to the truth. The girl woke up about 15 minutes later. I heard her moaning from the living room. Turning away from the window where I had kept a constant watch, I saw her rising on the table, her small face a mask of pain and confusion. "Where am I?" she asked. "You're just across the street from your house," I said. "We brought you inside." "Where's my dad?" she said. I just shook my head. "I haven't seen any living people on the street in over 20 minutes. If your dad is alive, then he must have left. There are probably people hiding in the woods until things cool down," I replied. In truth, I thought that there was no chance at all that her father was still alive. I walked over to the girl and put my hand on her shoulder. She flinched back, her dark brown hair falling over her face as she pulled away. "I'm not going to hurt you," I said. "My name's Julius and my friend's name is Richie. You already know Richie though, right?" She nodded. "I've seen him a few times mowing the lawn and stuff, but I don't really know him," she responded. "Well, he's one of the good guys, and so am I. That's why we brought you inside and bandaged up your leg. I even gave you stitches, though I don't know how professional they look. They'll do the job until we can get you to a hospital, though, I think." "My name's Alice," she said, smiling, red spots rising on her pale cheeks. Thanks, I guess, but do you know?" At that moment, the lights flickered. They came back to life for a moment and they died again. Come on," I said. Richie sprang up from the couch, navigating his way through the dark to the kitchen. I heard him shuffling through the drawers and then he pulled out 2 flashlights. He turned one on and then began to walk over to give me the other. "No need," I said, turning the attachable light on the rifle on. Its LED light looked blinding, much brighter than Richie's 2 flashlights. He turned and gave the other to Alice. "Thanks," she said shyly, turning it on. I went back to the window, deciding to check and see if there was any movement yet. With the streetlights out, I could barely see anything. I shone my light through the window and screamed when I saw a figure standing inches away on the other side of the window, grinning. Strange white tentacles covered the area where its eyes should have been, writhing and undulating, thick with slime and blood. Underneath it, I could see the face splitting in 2 as its grin spread ever wider, separating except for 5 inches of bone and glistening muscles at the back. Hundreds of sharp, serrated teeth gleamed in the light. Its body looked skinned, wet with blood that dripped from its bony fingers. It closed its mouth, the flesh coming together without any line or mark indicating where it had separated. And in a gurgling voice it spoke.
"The experiment is nearly complete. We will keep the strong alive, and in the end you will stand alone, and to us you will return. But do not be afraid, we will make the strong eternal."
"Why are you doing this?" I screamed, my finger tightening on the trigger. I wanted to blow apart this monstrous apparition, but something inside told me to hold my fire. I had a feeling that he had not come alone, and if I began shooting, it might force them to invade the house and attack me.
"You have 3 hours left until the experiment ends,"
it said, turning to leave. It ignored my question. I watched the muscles on its skinless body contracting as it walked away, the huge tentacles sprouting from its head constantly writhing like snakes. I saw the alien creature walk over to the woods on the other side of the street, where 2 more of its kind stood waiting, both naked and skinned. A man in a black robe with the hood pulled over his face followed behind them as they disappeared into the shadows. I hadn't realized just how massive they were until a human form stood directly beside one. They towered over him at least 8 feet tall, with their tentacles stretching out far behind them. I turned to see Richie and Alice standing horror-struck in the kitchen. They were preparing some of the perishable food by flashlight, making ham sandwiches with cheese and lettuce, drinking milk and orange juice. I sat down grabbing a sandwich and taking a bite. "Well, Richie," I said through a mouthful of sandwich, "I think you're right about them experimenting on us. I don't know why or what they hope to accomplish, but something intelligent is clearly using us as guinea pigs. And did you hear what it said? What's going to happen in 3 hours? Is that when they plan on killing all of us, the survivors? They already wiped out most of the town," she said bitterly. "They killed my mom." "And they killed my family too," I said. "And I think we'll all be dead soon if we don't do something. We can't stay here, we have to get out of town. We have to warn people what's happening here." "You said those government goons already know about it though," Richie said. "Who else are we going to warn? No one would believe us for a minute. I mean, I barely believe it." I felt like I had been slapped. I hadn't thought about the men in the black SUVs ever since we took Alice in. Where had they gone? Why weren't they here? Tracking down people associated with the anomaly and shooting them. Unless they had abandoned the town. Perhaps it had gone too far for such measures to be of any use. Perhaps that was why they had disabled 911 by the time that I got to Richie's house. A shiver of fear ran through my body as I contemplated it. "What about getting revenge for Melissa and your wife?" He pointed at me. "And your mother." He pointed at Alice. I laughed at that. "Revenge with what? The 3 magazines that I have left for this rifle. You guys don't have any weapons and she's only a 10-year-old girl. I want revenge just as much as anyone, but we have to focus on surviving. Most of all, we had to focus on her surviving," I said, nodding towards Alice. "We're the only people left now who can help her get out of here alive." Richie was about to say something when a shrieking had started outside. I heard a man yelling for his life. I ran to the window and saw somebody banging on Alice's house across the street. "Oh God, please help me, someone," he screamed. When no one answered, he began running towards Richie's house. I figured he had been doing this for a couple minutes, but when he saw the beam of the detachable flashlight and the gun through the front window, his eyes widened. "Oh, thank God. Please let me in, they're right behind me." I looked at the man in wonder for a long moment, and then recognition came to me. This was the agent that I had ambushed in the woods. I could tell by the broken nose and the bloody mark on his forehead, the black suit that he wore, and even by his cold eyes. Without thinking, I ran to the hallway and flung open the front door. "Come in," I whispered, "and stop yelling. You're going to attract everything in a 10-mile radius with that." And then I saw what was behind him, coming up the dark street, and my words caught in my throat. A dozen agents in black suits walked forward, bone-white tentacles whipping crazily around their heads. Their eyes were gone, the entire top of their head replaced by those strange alien appendages. Below it, I saw their mouths gnashing, constantly biting the air with bloody, serrated teeth. They were coming in our direction. "Time to go," I yelled into the house at Richie and Alice. They had been preparing backpacks of food and water. In a flash, they were out of the house, Alice gripping Richie's hand tightly as her small face contorted with fear at the sight of the agents. I had to put in a fresh magazine after we got in the house. Aiming through the sights, I began to fire, my ears ringing as fire erupted from the barrel. Blood erupted from the chests and faces of the agents, their tentacles splitting apart and spewing black fluid on the pavement below. Their high-pitched animalistic shrieks echoed off the pavement as they ran forward in a blur. I remember seeing 2 of them fall, and then 4, and then another couple stumbled as the gun clicked beneath my finger. I had gone through all 30 rounds and it wasn't enough. 3 of them still ran at us when a blinding light flashed above the trees. I heard a thwacking sound and a powerful engine roaring behind it. I looked up just in time to see a Black Hawk helicopter flying overhead. A man with a machine gun began firing, mowing down all the remaining agents in a matter of moments. He turned the gun towards those crawling on the ground still alive, and with a flash of bullets, they stopped moving as well. And then he slowly began to turn the gun on us. I had started to reload, slamming the magazine in as fast as I could. Without thinking, I raised it and I looked through the sights and fired. As if in slow motion, I saw the man above me in the helicopter jerk before falling out of the side door. With a heavy thud, his body hit the lawn of Richie's house far below. The helicopter kept flying and soon disappeared over the forest, the sound of its blades receding and then disappearing within seconds. I turned to Richie, seeing his sweaty face and wide, bloodshot eyes. The agent stood behind him, his face covered in blood. Richie still held Alice's hand, and the girl had her face pressed against his chest, silently crying. "We really need to get out of here," I said, looking hard at the agent. I wondered how much he knew and how much he would tell me. Our bedraggled group, bloody and sore and injured, began walking as one towards the trail down the street, one that I knew ran through a nature reserve and came out at the next town over. And as I listened to the agent talk, I realized just how wrong I had been about everything happening in my town. The man said that his name was Agent Kellerson, and what he told the group mostly lined up with what he had told me when I had ambushed and beat him. Their secret government agency, which he would only call the Cleaners, had been alerted to the presence of a potential anomaly in our little town. Whoever had alerted them had made it sound like it was only a couple scattered cases of families being replaced. But when they arrived, if they found the trickle had turned into a tsunami. Townspeople flooded at 911 with calls around the time that I had called, until they had to turn off the service and deliver a pre-recorded message announcing that emergency services were suspended. It didn't help that most of the police were themselves either replaced or being attacked by psychotic family members. "And so we began to contain and eliminate the anomaly by the only means available," he said. "Anytime a 911 call alerted us to the presence of a potential replaced family, we would go and exterminate the group to prevent a further spread of the sickness throughout the community. Yet it got to the point where nearly every house on every street had become compromised. We began having to go from house to house, still quickly alerted by any 911 calls in the meantime, until our agents became overwhelmed. That was when we found you hiding in your neighbor's house, and we were ordered to eliminate you and your family immediately. But we never got a chance to find your wife and daughter due to circumstances that you already know. We had to put all our resources towards tracking you before you escaped, and potentially spreading the contamination further. And then we planned to come back and exterminate the doppelgangers. After you ambushed me and tied me up, I sat there waiting for about 5 minutes for the rest of the group to come in my direction and free me. But then I began to give up hope on them finding me quickly. I still heard them talking far off through the trees, but they had stopped moving forwards. I was able to shimmy towards the face of the cliff and rub the cloth bindings against a jagged piece of rock until I freed my hands. By that point, I knew something had gone wrong with the rest of my group. For one, I could hear their screams echoing through the forest, so I looked in their direction. Dozens of their bright LED lights still bounced around crazily, sending chaotic shadows reaching out everywhere. I couldn't tell what the heck was going on. I heard my team leader yelling orders, trying to get the men in line, and then the shooting started. All of the guns started firing at once, spraying hundreds of rounds in seconds. A blinding purple light shot out of the area, and instantly everything went deathly silent. The agent went pale as he recalled this, walking next to us over the rocky trail that wound up a hill and down into the next town over, which was located in a valley. I snuck close to the chaos, trying to see what was happening without getting directly involved. I needed to see so I could figure out the source of the anomaly. I thought that I might be able to report it to my superiors, and then we could work to quickly eliminate it, root and branch. I saw something in the ground half buried. What stuck out had strange silver and gold spires, as thin as silk, as if they had been spun by some alien spider. They intertwined and interweaved in thin tapering columns, no more than a few inches wide at the base, rising 20 feet above the ground. The agents all stood around like zombies, not saying a word. They swayed slightly on their feet, like plants blown in a light breeze, their movements synchronized and eerie. It seemed like a single consciousness ran through them, controlling them like puppets. The purple light started up again, coming out in rippling waves. It moved out slowly, forming iridescent ripples and fractal patterns with grid-like energy that crawled through the trees and brush. I saw the silver and gold spires also begin to light up, glowing as the purple light formed some strange sort of cyclone around the spires, spiraling up around them in perfect circles. The mouths of all the agents dropped open at once as their flesh began to ripple and melt before my eyes. I started to crawl away quickly then, trying to make as little noise as possible. When I last looked back, I saw the tentacles growing out of their faces, like a parasite ripping its way out of somebody's skin. He shuddered. "So what happens now?" Richie asked. "What is the next step for your organization when all the agents on the ground are dead? Or worse?" "Well, according to military doctrine, if the first line of ground offense is removed, the next logical step is to take the air," he said. "That's NATO doctrine, and the CIA and all other agencies generally follow the military principles outlined by the NATO generals and leaders." "So we can expect airstrikes?" I asked, horrified, and he nodded. "Helicopters with machine guns, airstrikes, artillery shells, everything. This place is going to be lit up soon. We want to be as far away as possible from the center of town that we can get. In the past, they haven't hesitated to use biological or chemical weapons on the entire area. Heck, one time I remember our group was assigned to a town where the water supply got contaminated by some sort of alien fungus, and it transformed the people into a hive mind. Most of the cleaners got wiped out on that one, and nearly all the CIA agents too. They ended up having to exterminate the entire area with nerve agents like sarin and cyclosarin, until nothing was moving on the ground. The town is still blocked off by military roadblocks. They use the old line that a coal mine caught on fire underground and that it'll burn for decades. But everybody higher up in the government knows the truth. We had progressed far up the trail by this point, and I could see the entire town below us. Not a single light shone in any of the houses. No cars drove by on the roads below. The place looked eerie and abandoned. Yet occasionally a scream of terror or pain would rip through the night, faint but clear, echoing up to the tops of the hills and through the trees until it faded out to nothing. I saw multiple helicopters crisscrossing the skies. They used giant spotlights to sweep the roads in the front and back of houses, looking for any sign of movement. Occasionally, automatic weapons fire would begin shrieking from above, a sign that they had gotten another one, though whether they were murdering just doppelgangers or innocent civilians or both, I didn't know. I wasn't even sure how many innocent civilians could still be alive after the chaos and bloodshed that we had seen. Based on the fact that the helicopter machine gunner had started to target me before I killed him, I believed they were going around murdering anything that moved. Perhaps the anomaly had spread so fast that they thought they had no other options. As we examined the view under a cloudy nighttime sky, the first non-human craft began to blur across the horizon. They flew low, barely clearing the tree line, and moved much faster than any jet. And yet it gave off no sonic boom and didn't even make a noise. It moved forwards in a strange, jarring manner, jumping from one point to another in a blur and then suddenly slowing down. I only caught a glimpse of the craft, a tangle of silver and gold filaments that formed a lattice pattern across the massive body. It had the same kind of architecture as the spires that Agent Kellerson had described, being composed of thin, curving strands that rose up and down the body of the craft. It glowed a soft blue, giving off a low humming sound and emanating a smell like ozone and freon. Moving in a graceful arch, it flew across the town like a great golden dragon. Behind it, I saw 3 fighter jets, furiously trying to catch up to the alien craft. They fired missiles which sprouted fiery trails and raced across the sky, smashing into the back of the craft's body. A flash of light pierced the dark sky as the missile ignited, its bellowing explosion echoing over the hills towards us a moment later. The craft came to a complete halt in the air, freezing in place as if a video had been paused. As the smoke and fire cleared, it still hovered there, the blue aura still surrounding it, its exterior totally intact. The fighter jets closed in on it, their engines screaming as they drew near. The blue light shimmering around the craft grew rapidly, forming a cloud that seemed to suck in the air around it. Jets of lightning began to burst out of the cloud, dozens of branching streams of energy that hit all 3 jets in an instant. Pieces of their planes exploded, flames leaping out of the shell, and then a second wave of lightning struck, and their planes dissolved into pieces. The cloud that surrounded the craft dispersed, blown away by the wind. Slowly, almost lazily, it started to move forwards again, its strange engines humming, filling the destroyed town with the scent of ozone as the victors flew away. We continued on our way, trying to make good time. Alice had started complaining about her leg hurting her after a couple miles. Richie and I had tried taking turns carrying her, but she was simply too heavy to carry in the dark over a trail filled with roots and rocks that stuck up, trying to grab a foot like a catcher catching a baseball. Her leg had started to bleed again, and I could see a red spot where these stitches lay. "This isn't good," Agent Kellerson said to us as the girl limped further behind. "We might need to leave her behind." "There's no way we're doing that," Richie whispered angrily. "If we don't get out of this town in the 3-hour timeline, we're all dead. You understand that, right? Should we sacrifice all of us for a girl who would die anyway if she's not out of town?" Agent Kellerson retorted. "We don't know that they plan to kill us at the end of the time limit," I said, thinking of the strange, tentacled face that I had seen through the window and the glimpse of white, staring eyes behind the writhing appendages. I had seen them only for a moment, like a shooting star glimpsed out of the corner of the eye, but the intelligence contained in those strange orbs had been undeniable. I looked back, checking on Alice. She lagged further behind than ever. I groaned, stopping to go and check on her. I heard a rustle through the trees as I circled back. My heart leapt as I spun towards the noise, raising the rifle. Behind the bushes and through the shadows and branches, I saw myself. I was wearing the same clothes and the same hoodie that Richie had given me. I had the same haircut, the same shoes, everything. Except the eyes weren't the same. They gleamed with insanity, shone with a psychotic rage, powerful enough to dissolve reality. Behind myself, I saw the other members of our group scattered randomly in the distance. Alice, Agent Kellerson, and Richie, all standing behind trees or hiding behind bushes, peering out in the dim light that filtered through the brush. Alice had caught up with me now. She stood staring into the dark forest, her eyes filled with horror as she saw the doppelgangers, still as statues with insane rictus grins, scarring every one of their faces. I remember the words of that tentacled abomination through the window verbatim, even now, months later. He had said, "We will keep the strong alive." I thought that he meant survivors, but something was knocked loose in my mind as I considered the vagueness of it. Perhaps he meant that they would keep the doppelgangers alive if they had killed their original. Maybe he had meant the strongest of the two entities, one insane and fearless and one rational and human. I raised the gun to fire on my doppelganger and take him out of the equation for good when somebody tackled me from behind. I went flying forwards under the unexpected attack, my head smacking hard against a tree as the ground knocked the wind out of my lungs. The gun went flying over my head and landed a foot away as I lay there, seeing stars and trying to breathe. In a dreamlike state, I saw Al's doppelganger approaching me, reaching into the back of his pants for something. I breathed fast, willing myself to move to go for the gun. My head swam and the world seemed dark. I felt blood dripping down my scalp, curving around my ear in a small stream. Al pulled out a claw hammer, the sharp end already covered in hair and blood. He grinned at me. "Time to get some work done," he said in his old man's trembling voice, running at me with the hammer raised. I heard yelling from Richie and Agent Kellerson as they turned and began coming back towards me, but they seemed so far away. I took a deep breath as Al lunged at me with murder shining in his face. I raised my foot up and I kicked him square in the crotch as hard as I could. His trajectory as he came down with the hammer didn't change much because of it, but I saw his eyes widen in pain. But the sharp end of the hammer was still whirring through the air towards my skull, his entire body following its path. I rolled away, hearing the hammer crash into the earth with a dull thud a moment later. Richie reached me then. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small paring knife as he ran forward, something that he must have grabbed from the kitchen before he left. As Al breathed hard on the ground next to me, his eyes unfocused and filled with pain, Richie brought the knife down in the middle of his throat. The entire blade had disappeared, slicing through his flesh as easily as a diver slips through the skin of the water. He spasmed and kicked, choking on the blood as he inhaled. I heard a terrible groaning, sucking noise as he tried to breathe. Bright red fluid spurted in and out in time with his breath, bubbling over the handle of the knife. He looked at me, still grinning, slowly reaching over as if he wanted to hold my hand. I had regained myself by then after what was probably a mild concussion, rolling onto my feet and grabbing my gun. I stood up slowly and shakily, feeling like I wanted to vomit. I looked into the woods, wanting to eliminate my doppelganger before he could kill me. But sometime during the struggle with Al, the whole group of them had disappeared. I could see panic spread through the group as I told them what Alice and I had seen. Agent Kellerson demanded his M4 service rifle back. "That gun is government property," he said petulantly, like a child demanding a toy. "It is by all rights registered to me." "Oh, you lost your rights to the gun when you tried to kill me," I said, raising the barrel and putting it in his face. "If you want it back, then try to take it. I dare you, just come and get it." Richie got in between the two of us, pushing us apart. "Come on, guys, we got enough problems without killing each other. We're wasting time just standing here and arguing, and the clock is running down quickly." He pulled his phone out of his pocket, checking the time. "It's already been over 2 hours. We have a little less than an hour left until the time limit runs out, and whatever they're planning to do comes about. I don't think we want to be anywhere near here when that happens." Alice continuously complained about the pain in her leg. She pulled her pant leg up to show me the angry red splotches that blossomed around the stitches. A small trickle of dark, almost black blood ran down her leg, and I saw that it had already stained her pants on one side. "We'll get you to a doctor as soon as we get out of here," I promised her, "but you have to keep going. We can't carry you the entire way." We had reached the peak of the hills surrounding the town and begun descending. The next town over was deep in a valley, and we would have to stumble down steep rocky trails to get there. From a distance, I heard the screaming of many powerful engines. I looked up to see fighter jets passing overhead in a blur, breaking the sound barrier. I felt the sonic boom in my bones as it passed through my body, vibrating my chest. I involuntarily clamped my teeth down on my lip when it went past, drawing a thin stream of blood. Their roaring started to fade into the distance before being punctuated by multiple explosions. I saw flashes of light exploding from the center of town, like a second sun rising into the night. A mushroom cloud of black smoke rose high into the sky, mixing with the dark clouds above. "Oh, that's not good," Agent Kellerson said, wiping sweat from his forehead as he stared dumbly back in the direction of the explosions. "Why not?" Alice had asked, keeping close to my side and limping heavily, trying to avoid her injured leg and wincing every time that she put weight on it. Once they start the airstrikes, it means that they've lost total control of the events on the ground, he said. You don't think they would use nuclear weapons on it, do you? Richie asked. Agent Kellerson shook his head. No, that would raise too many red flags, he answered. Radioactivity gets out and spreads, and it is detected by people all around the world. That's how some people in Europe knew about the Chernobyl nuclear explosion, even before the Soviet government had announced it. No, they would contain it with high-yield conventional explosives and artillery. And if that failed, they would likely spray chemical weapons until the area became uninhabitable for 100 years. They have enough secret stockpiles to wipe out 100 towns this size without even making a sizable dent. They might decide to drop VX nerve gas or cyclosarin from crop dusters and helicopters, and when they do, we want to be far upwind of the target area. What if we just get to the next town over and discover the same kind of stuff is happening? I asked, seeing a nightmarish vision of empty streets littered with bodies. I think my will would have broken if I had arrived there and found it filled with psychotic twins, especially after the loss of my family, and very likely the deaths of all my friends who live nearby, except of course for Richie. Little did I realize at the time that some of our group would not see the next town. Within minutes, 2 of us would die. I was walking next to Richie with Alice limping along in front of us. Agent Kellerson walked in the rear, continuously checking the trail behind us for signs of stalking. I felt watched from all sides. I wonder what kind of fuel that craft runs on, Richie was saying. Hydrogen fusion or antimatter, or maybe some sort of quantum state that we don't even know about yet. Well, actually, the government has reverse engineered at least one of the craft, Agent Kellerson said. It had an outer shell composed of a spinning substrate called Bose-Einstein condensate, a type of superfluid that defies gravity, and in the center. But we never got to hear about the engine. In a blur, 2 figures ran out of the bushes wielding axes dripping with blood. With eyes bulging, I saw my doppelganger swinging the axe down towards my head. I felt as if I saw it all in slow motion. I raised the automatic rifle and I pulled the trigger. The recoil made the gun raise up high as a burst of gunfire shattered the nighttime silence. The bullets missed the doppelganger by mere inches, smashing into trees a few inches above his head and raining splinters down on his hair and face. Realizing that I had run out of time, I tried to lunge to the side, but the axe caught me hard in the right shoulder. I felt it slice through the skin and shatter the collarbone below. I fell back, my arm going numb from the sudden shock of the attack. As I landed on the ground, the wind getting knocked out of my lungs, I saw Agent Kellerson stumbling back. The blade of an axe sunk deep into his forehead. He raised his hand to his spurting face, smacking his forehead as if he had just remembered something important. His lips opened, gasping, his legs trembling and wavering before he fell forward, the impact forcing the axe deeper into his skull. His murderer, his identical twin, lunged forward, wrenching at the axe and trying to pull it free. With every jerk to the left and right, more great gouts of blood gushed out. Richie fought back against his doppelganger. I saw his lunatic twin raising a gleaming butcher's knife. Richie had his hands up as if in supplication, the small paring knife he held loosely in one hand as he tried to back away. The doppelganger began to swing the blade wildly back and forth, 2 strokes slicing deep into Richie's chest. And then Alice began to scream behind me. I turned to see her crawling away from the mayhem, a small silhouette crouched in the bushes only a few feet away, only the white grinning teeth showing in the thick shadows of the brush, gleaming like some demonic Cheshire cat. As if stuck in some nightmare vision, I saw our group being slaughtered from all sides. Slowly, too slowly. I grabbed for the gun, seeing the flash of metal out of the corner of my eye as my doppelganger came in for the killing blow. I raised the gun above my head at the last possible moment, bracing myself for the blow. The blade came down on the side of the gun, sending jarring vibrations racing through my body. My shoulders felt like they had nearly gotten pulled out of their sockets, but at least I was still alive. I spun the barrel towards his face, pulling the trigger. It blew apart his cheeks and nose, and for a moment, I saw into my own skeletal face, the grinning teeth half blown to shards as the figure swayed like a boxer before a knockout. And then he fell forwards, landing heavily on top of me, covering me with my own blood, a somehow familiar stickiness and smell emanating from it as it flowed out. I fought against the corpse, kicking and rolling. The dead weight of it pressed the gun down on my chest. I heard Alice's pained shrieks, and even more terrifying, nothing at all from Richie. As I rolled my doppelganger off myself, heaving with a sudden burst of energy, I realized that I couldn't move or feel my right hand. I looked down and saw it, white and pale, laying as limp as a dead starfish. Using my left, I grabbed the gun, turning towards Agent Kellerson's doppelganger. I saw him standing over Richie's dead body, swinging the axe again and again into the meat of Richie's chest. Richie lay there staring at me, his eyes wide and horrified, his eyes seeming to become black as his pupils dilated in death. With every blow from the axe, his head shook, as if he were saying no. I shot the agent's doppelganger, my vision turning blurry for a moment. The burst of gunfire made my ears ring. With the shrieking tinnitus blurring my hearing, I turned towards Alice. I saw two of them dressed in identical clothing, both covered in blood and cuts. They bit and grabbed at each other, and I had no idea what to do. And then I realized that one of the doppelgangers was missing. I heard the rustling of bushes directly behind me. In the top of my vision, I saw the knife coming down. I rolled, but it slammed hard into my white and dead palm, pinning the numb hand in the ground as blood rushed out from the wound. With my other hand, I raised the gun and pointed it at the grinning figure of Richie. Without hesitation, I fired, opening up multiple holes in the center of his chest. I turned back to the Alices, wondering what I should do, but as I looked over, I found that I was too late. One stood over the other, choking her and pinning her to the ground. The girl on the top had blood seeping from her leg, and I had a surge of hope. That had to be the real Alice. The other one's face had turned purple, deepening and darkening into a sickly and suffocating shade, her lips turning blue. As she died, a wave of heat and light overtook us. An explosion rocked the earth moments later, shock waves passing through the ground. I turned back to the town, seeing a massive mushroom cloud rising up in the air. It seemed that nothing was left of it. In front of the massive ball of fire and smoke that emanated from the center area, a large blue cloud glimmered in the air. Soon I saw the alien craft speeding towards us in a blur, leaving the area that they had just obliterated. They came right towards Alice and me, the ship hovering above the trees. Moments later, the humanoid skinned beings faded into existence in front of me. I still stood on the ground with a gushing wound and a dead hand, stunned and in agony. Alice looked no better, covered in blood, her leg wound ripped open again, her face white and pale. She was breathing fast and trembled, looking like she might collapse. She stared at the three beings that manifested in front of us with a blank look on her face.
"You two are the last ones left alive,"
the one in front said, its bone-white tentacles writhing like snakes. Behind the massive tentacles on its face, I caught glimpses of two intelligent round eyes, pure white and lidless. They looked moist and glistened like opal, shining with rainbows and colors. Barely," I whispered. The being took out a strange black vial. With a reverent stance, he knelt down before me, cradling my head in his long and twisted hand, and then he took some of my blood from the wound. He stood and walked over to Alice, repeating this strange ritual. And then he talked to the others in a strange, guttural language with clicks and hisses mixed in randomly, the cadence fast and excited. He turned back to me.
"You are a survivor, you both are. You have proven yourselves worthy. You are worthy of life. When the cleansing comes, the time of renewal, we will exterminate all life unworthy of life and start your people anew from the blood of the survivors. A second Adam and a second Eve. Perhaps this time they will actually be created in the image of God, the true God, ourselves.
I saw at that moment that the two aliens behind him held small black canisters in their hands. One walked over to me and another walked over to Alice, spraying us both in the face. The world spun and then my vision went black, and I felt myself being lifted up before I was gone completely. I woke up in a hospital in the state capital. Alice was in the next room. We had no memory of how we got there or who had dropped us off. After all was said and done, I ended up losing most of my right arm in an emergency surgery. The injury from the axe wound had severed nerve endings and caused severe blood loss to the entirety of the limb, causing irreversible oxygen deprivation and permanent tissue death. The surgeon said that I got to them just in time. But as the months passed, I felt I lost something much more fundamental, something greater. I've been in contact with Alice's foster family, and they said that she's acting strange and not talking. I wonder if I made a mistake. The entire experience was a nightmare that I want to erase from my memory forever. It led to the death of my family and friends and the crippling of my body. I can only hope that I never see those writhing bone-white tentacles again.